Hey guys, good evening. Tonight, as the world outside begins to quiet down, we're going to dim the lights on your day and journey together into a very specific corner of history. We're diving deep not into the well-trodden paths of Augustus or Caesar, but into a collection of history's greatest footnotes, the Roman emperors you've likely never heard of. And frankly, dear listener, the universe itself seemed to conspire to forget them. They flickered onto the imperial stage like tiny anxious candles in a roaring storm, barely warming the throne before often quite literally being extinguished. Imagine, if you will, the bustling, sometimes utterly bewildering, narrow, winding streets of ancient Rome. Picture the soft glow of oil lamps starting to appear as dusk falls, the distant murmur of conversation, perhaps the clatter of a passing cart over worn cobblestones. But now try to dial that background hum of city life up to 11 in your mind's ear. Because beneath that seemingly calm surface, or often right on it, a very expensive empire was changing hands like a hot potato. A flaming, incredibly heavy hot potato, often leaving a messy trail of fleeting glory, intense intrigue, and utter bewilderment for all involved. We're talking about emperors who lasted about as long as a single scoop of gelato on a scorching July afternoon. Poof, gone. And that was often considered a good run. Let's be honest with each other. This journey tonight through the reigns of these largely forgotten rulers is designed for relaxation. You probably won't survive this entire story without gently drifting off, and that, my friends, is perfectly, absolutely okay. In fact, it's part of the plan. This isn't about memorizing dates or intricate family trees. It's about allowing the gentle cadence of their brief, tumultuous lives to lull you into a state of profound peace. So before you allow yourself to sink further into your most comfortable spot, take a moment if you're able, and if the mood truly takes you, to give this video a gentle like and consider subscribing. And if you're feeling up to it in the morning, perhaps let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now as you prepare to surrender to sleep. Now truly dim the lights. Let any lingering tensions in your shoulders and neck gently ease away. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft rhythmic background hum, or perhaps a white noise app that mimics the gentle sound of distant Roman fountains. Take a slow, deep breath, holding it for a moment, and then exhaling slowly, letting go of the day's worries. Another slow, deep breath. And another. And as you breathe, let's ease into tonight's journey together, allowing the ancient echoes to calm and soothe you. We're kicking things off in a spectacularly unsavory moment in Rome's long history. The year is 193 CE. Just 3 months earlier, the Emperor Pertinax will meet him properly later, but for now just know he was trying oh so valiantly to restore a bit of Roman dignity and fiscal sanity, has just been unceremoniously and quite fatally offed by his very own Praetorian Guard. Now close your eyes gently and picture this guard. These weren't your garden-variety palace guards standing around looking decorative. Imagine, if you will, an elite, highly paid, often utterly spoiled special forces unit that decided the best, most expedient way to earn a hefty bonus was to shake down the entire Roman Empire. They were in effect a force unto themselves, more akin to an organized crime syndicate in gilded armor. With Pertinax, their troublesome emperor, conveniently gone, Rome, the very heart of the civilized world, finds itself in an utterly scandalous, truly unprecedented pickle. The most powerful job in the world, the imperial purple itself, the title of Augustus, is for the very first time in Rome's long, proud, and often bloody history, openly, brazenly, shamelessly put up for sale. Just imagine the absolute disbelief that must have rippled through the populace. Picture it more vividly now. You're perhaps walking near the formidable walls of the Praetorian camp, a vast, imposing military installation right on the edges of the capital. Perhaps you're trying to grab a quick, slightly too salty street dolma from a vendor, the rich aroma of spices filling the evening air. Suddenly, a jarring commotion shatters the quiet rhythm of the city. You hear shouts and alarming clanging of armor that resonates through the evening air, and then a herald, his voice echoing from the camp walls, proclaiming quite brazenly to the open city that the imperial purple, that ridiculously expensive snail slime-dyed toga of supreme unquestionable power, is now officially available to the highest bidder. This wasn't some hushed, secretive backroom deal, not some whispered conspiracy in the shadows. Oh no. This was effectively a live auction, the biggest, most scandalous one in all of recorded history, happening right on the very visible, very public edges of the Eternal City. The Praetorians, the very men sworn to guard the Emperor with their lives, are literally shouting bids from their camp walls, quite openly inviting candidates, powerful men from the capital, to simply pay up for the ultimate prize. Into this absolute astonishing mess steps Titus Flavius Sulpicianus. Now Sulpicianus has a bit of an in here, if you could call it that, during a bidding war for the emperorship. He's the former city prefect of Rome, a respected official, and more importantly, more immediately, he's Pertinac's very own father-in-law. Imagine his arrival at the Praetorian camp. Is he in mourning for his dead son-in-law, not according to the historical accounts? He appears to be trying to negotiate his very direct, very rapid way onto the newly vacated throne. His opening offer is a significant one, a grand gesture, 20,000 sesterces to each and every Praetorian guard. Now, to give you some context, 20,000 sesterces is roughly about 10 years' pay for a common soldier. Not too shabby at all. You can almost feel the excitement, hear the whispers spreading through the ranks of the Praetorians, their eyes lighting up like modern-day shoppers on a truly chaotic Black Friday. The smell of cold, hard cash, or rather cold, hard bronze and silver coins filling the air. But then, just as Sulpicianus is getting comfortable with his bid, a formidable challenger emerges, ready to raise the stakes dramatically. Here he comes rolling up in his proverbial chariot, quite possibly after a very leisurely, very expensive dinner party, Didius Julianus. Julianus is a wealthy, distinguished if somewhat uninspired and frankly rather ordinary senator. He wasn't particularly popular among the general Roman populace, who probably grumbled openly about his famously extravagant banquets and his overall air of self-indulgence. He's described as a man known for a bit of a lazy disposition, far more interested in fine dining, easy living and luxurious leisure than the crushing, truly burdensome demands of governing an entire fractious empire. But critically, he had the money, or at least the very confident promise of it. Sulpicianus, still inside the Praetorian camp, is negotiating, and he suddenly hears Julianus's booming counteroffer echoing from outside the formidable walls. The bids climb quickly now with escalating drama. Sulpicianus, perhaps feeling the heat, shouts 20,000. Julianus counters with 25,000. Sulpicianus, perhaps desperate, ups it to 28,000. And then Julianus, reportedly just wanting the guards to declare him emperor, right there on the spot before he'd even consider entering the camp to shake hands, screams his final, utterly astronomical offer. Back 25,000 sesterces to each and every man. Not per rank, not per unit, but asterisk to each and every Praetorian asterisk. That's a sum so utterly astronomical, it would make a modern lottery winner blush with envy. Imagine promising a whole legion of unruly armed guards several decades' worth of salary each just for them to sign a dotted line, or rather yell out your name. It's the imperial equivalent of, "Here's all my money, please just let me wear the fancy purple hat, and I'll even throw in a lifetime supply of snails for purple dye." The guards, ever pragmatic, who'd been weighing up who would be easier to control, the dead emperor's honest-ish, perhaps slightly dull father-in-law, or the undeniably rich, probably pliable, luxury-loving senator who just offered them an unheard-of fortune, made their very swift choice. Julianus wins. He's ushered into the camp, a sense of immediate triumph in the air, declared emperor on the spot, and then immediately taken to the Senate House, escorted tellingly by heavily armed soldiers rather than any cheering citizens. You can almost hear the stunned silence, the muttering among the public. Now historians still argue whether this was a true auction in the theatrical open bidding sense, or merely the culmination of the guards extorting the absolute highest possible donativum, a kind of bonus, traditionally paid to soldiers upon an emperor's accession, but usually not well bid upon. Whatever the specific etiquette of their spectacularly corrupt transaction, the result was clear power was explicitly purchased openly shamelessly, and the Roman Empire itself was now quite literally for sale. The proud but now deeply frustrated people of Rome predictably were furious, throwing stones and curses, not celebratory flowers, at their new bought and paid for ruler. Not exactly the best start to an emperorship, but then very few of the emperors we're going to talk about today had what you'd call best starts. Let that thought gently drift through your mind, allowing the sounds and images of ancient Rome to soften and fade into the background. So Didius Julianus, still basking in his dubious ill-gotten victory, finds himself officially declared emperor. Can you imagine stepping into the very top job after literally outbidding another guy for it? There's no warm applause, no joyous confetti, just the stony silence of the senators who clearly thought this whole spectacular display was an affront to pretty much everything Rome had ever stood for. They sat there forced, utterly coerced to legitimize a transaction that smacked of desperation and the deepest depravity. And Julianus, after pledging an unimaginable amount of wealth to the greedy praetorians, swiftly proceeded to try and not pay them the full promised sum. This, let's be utterly honest, was an immediate and truly critical miscalculation. You simply do not mess with the pay of the very same guys who just made you boss, and then quite casually, quite lethally offed the previous boss. That is perhaps rule number 1 in imperial Rome. And frankly, this rather uninspired, luxury-loving emperor was just not cut out for the cutthroat, ruthlessly dangerous world of the 3rd century Roman Empire. He's probably thinking in his lavish new imperial quarters, right, just need to secure some extra funds, maybe tax the wealthy. No wait, I'm the wealthy. This is far more complicated than bidding on a fancy vase from my garden. The mainstream historical fact here is glaring undeniably clear. Etched in the annals of Roman history, Julianus's brief reign is almost entirely defined by its overwhelming illegitimacy and the Roman public's sheer visceral disgust. When he tried to appear in public, venturing outside his heavily guarded palace, the Romans didn't just grumble softly. They hurled venomous insults. They threw rough, jagged rocks, and famously they yelled devastating curses. People in Rome probably hated him more than they hated morning traffic on the incredibly congested streets, which, let me tell you, is saying something in an ancient city designed before automobiles. He tried everything, every trick in the book to win over the people, offering grand games and circuses, staging impressive public festivals, even attempting to genuinely address the chronic grain supply issues that always plagued the massive capital city, which relied heavily on imported food. But it was all too little too late, and entirely unconvincing coming from a man who had so clearly, so brazenly bought his crown at auction. He tried weakly to claim he was restoring stability after the turbulent, unsettling deaths of Commodus and Pertinax. But the common person on the street, the vendor, the farmer, the shopkeeper, simply saw him as the blatant symptom of profound corruption, not the genuine cure. You can almost hear the weary vendors muttering among themselves. First he buys the purple, now he expects us to cheer for him. Not on my watch, and certainly not for that ridiculous price he paid. The audacity. Allow that soft historical grumbling to gently recede as your mind relaxes. The quirky tidbit of Julianus's short rule points to just how truly isolated and utterly paranoid he was. There's a story that Julianus, perpetually worried about potential assassination attempts, would dine privately, often with only his closest, most trusted servants. He'd have his food tested repeatedly for poison by various tasters, a truly elaborate ritual. And to prevent any collusion, he would even bring in a completely new chef for each meal, effectively rotating the entire culinary department on a daily basis. Can you imagine the overhead, the sheer logistical nightmare on that imperial culinary department? This isn't exactly the sign of a secure and beloved ruler embraced by his people and his court. More like someone who watched far too many murder mysteries before bed. He might as well have put up a large, very visible "Do not poison me today, thank you very much" sign in his enormous imperial kitchen. The entire situation was so dire, so completely scandalous, that the regular Roman citizens, those folks who normally minded their own business selling fish, discussing the price of olives, and arguing endlessly about gladiators, actually remarkably openly sided with three competing, far more capable and crucially popular provincial generals who immediately started marching on Rome the very moment news of Julianus's preposterous auction spread across the empire. Talk about instant overwhelming opposition. He bought the crown only to find the throne already under siege. Julianus had purchased an empire that was essentially already being fiercely contested by these three far more capable and significantly more popular provincial governors. There was Pescennius Niger, based in the vital province of Syria in the east. Clodius Albinus, commanding legions in the distant province of Britain. And finally, Septimius Severus, a dynamic, fiercely ambitious, and incredibly ruthless general based in Pannonia, a key province along the Danube frontier. Each of these formidable men commanded powerful, loyal legions, and each of them immediately scoffed at the very idea, the absolute audacity, that the world's most powerful position could simply be bought from a disgruntled, greedy guard unit in Rome. Severus in particular, a man of profound drive and tactical genius, moved with breathtaking, almost unbelievable speed. You can picture him barely registering the news of Julianus's ridiculous, illegitimate accession before gathering his battle-hardened legions, preparing their supplies, and pointing them squarely at Rome, an unyielding, determined force. It's the ancient equivalent of seeing a hilariously but utterly unqualified new CEO of your company buy his way in and immediately drafting your resignation letter, not just to quit, but to form a vastly more successful rival company and put him out of business entirely. Julianus's short reign, a mere 66 days, is a textbook case of sheer hubris meeting an incredibly harsh reality. As Severus's disciplined legions, a force of thousands, approached the very gates of Rome, the Praetorian Guard, who were ostensibly Julianus's chosen protectors, the men who had put him on the throne, began quite visibly to waver. Their promised enormous pay, after all, was contingent on an emperor actually having an empire to govern, and it was looking less and less like Julianus would maintain one for much longer. The money he had promised had been utterly enormous, an almost crippling sum for the state treasury, and a significant, uncomfortable portion was still embarrassingly unpaid. Do you remember that moment in a cartoon, perhaps, when the hero has an army of loyal followers behind him, but then they slowly, almost imperceptibly, start looking over their shoulders at a looming threat and just quietly, individually walking away? That, dear listener, was Julianus's Praetorian Guard, his supposed lifeline, subtly abandoning him in his hour of desperate need. He even, in a moment of utter desperation, tried to negotiate with Severus, offering to bizarrely share the emperorship, or to even just retreat quietly, perhaps to become a private citizen, and live out his days in quiet, unharassed luxury. Historians still argue whether Julianus genuinely believed Severus would accept a shared rule, given Severus's well-known ambition and overwhelming military strength. It feels, doesn't it, more like a desperate, panicked plea than a serious, credible negotiation whispered in the shadow of Severus's approaching legions. The Senate, always opportunistic, always acutely aware of which way the imperial wind was blowing, witnessing the tide of power inexorably turning, rapidly abandoned their auction winner. The mainstream historical view is that their official decision to declare Severus emperor, fully recognizing his powerful claims, and simultaneously sentence Julianus to death, was less about a principled moral stance and far, far more about their own very immediate survival. After all, the Senate had been coerced, pressured, and forced to officially ratify Julianus's accession in the first place just weeks earlier. Remember. Now they had to be seen without any shred of doubt to be on the right side of the victorious general. Imagine the scene softly in your mind. The very same senators who probably bowed and scraped, offered flattering words and congratulations just weeks earlier now, quickly perhaps with trembling, eager hands drawing up the papers to execute the very man they'd just confirmed. Julianus was eventually cornered and executed in the opulent private palace baths, a rather undignified end, just 66 days after he'd effectively bought the throne of the most powerful empire in the world. His final words are reputed to have been, "What evil have I done, whom have I killed?" Which, considering he presided over a chaotic, widely condemned bribery scandal and alienated nearly everyone in Rome, felt less like a genuine question, and more like a spectacularly oblivious and quite pathetic summary of his brief and deeply unpopular emperorship. And just like that, the Roman Empire was up for sale again, or rather decisively claimed by a powerful, ruthless man who took it by overwhelming force rather than coin. But before Julianus, before this truly infamous auction, there was another far more noble though equally ill-fated emperor whose earnest story began the chaotic chain of events leading to the most scandalous imperial auction. His attempts at restoring true order to a decadent, wasteful regime actually sparked the Praetorians' fatal, greedy anger. Close your eyes and allow this image of a fading emperor to guide you deeper into quietude, preparing your mind for the gentle tide of sleep. You remember that utter chaos in Rome we just talked about with Julianus trying to buy the entire empire like a gilded piece of merchandise? Well, all that roaring political dumpster fire, that monumental upheaval started quite precisely with the emperor before him, a remarkable, unassuming, deeply principled man by the name of Pertinax. If Julianus was the flamboyant embodiment of lazy-bought decadence of self-serving luxury, then Pertinax, his ill-fated predecessor, was his complete and utter opposite. Imagine him a disciplined, tirelessly hard-working, remarkably honest ex-schoolteacher, believe it or not, who ended up by a twist of incredible fate, becoming an accidental emperor. Now that, my friends, is a career pivot, if I ever saw one in all of history. Can you imagine your own stern but kind history teacher suddenly unexpectedly ruling the world? You'd be like, wait, is he going to give us homework assignments on governance and will it be graded in sesterces? The sheer unexpectedness of his rise is remarkable, adding to the poignant nature of his story. Born Publius Helvius Pertinax, he hailed from a far more humble background than most emperors who usually boasted ancient, illustrious aristocratic families stretching back centuries. His father, in a testament to Rome's complex social mobility, was a freedman, meaning he was once enslaved, but through hard work, or perhaps the kindness of a master, gained his precious freedom. This right from the very start is already a pretty unique, almost unheard of beginning for someone aiming for the absolute top spot in Roman society. Pertinax began his working life as a grammar school teacher, patiently, meticulously correcting Latin syntax, perhaps guiding eager but often unruly Roman school children through complex literary texts dealing with their youthful exuberance, which in its own peculiar way is probably excellent, absolutely unparalleled preparation for handling the sometimes equally unruly, childishly petulant Roman Senate. This humble beginning, this grounded perspective makes his ascent to the throne even more truly remarkable. A profound testament to his genuine intelligence, his unwavering perseverance, and his considerable hard-won military skill. Think of him as the ultimate meritocrat in a world still largely defined by birthright, powerful family connections, and corrupt patronage. He wasn't relying on nepotism. He was building a resume from scratch, one meticulously planned battle, one expertly negotiated peace treaty, and one impeccably administered province at a time. A slow, steady, honorable climb. His military career after that initial, perhaps unglamorous but character-building teaching stint was truly stellar, a string of triumphs and careful commands. He climbed the ranks swiftly, proving his immense worth in campaigns across various demanding Roman provinces, the windswept fields of Britain, the dense forests of Dacia, modern-day Romania, the arid lands of Syria, and even bravely holding the line against the fierce Germanic tribes along the vital Danube River. He gained an unshakable reputation as a stern but consistently fair commander, widely admired by his soldiers for his personal courage, his rigorous attention to detail, and his unwavering discipline. He distinguished himself so thoroughly, so completely, that he even remarkably became a senator, a truly massive social and political leap for a man of his once humble background. This entire trajectory speaks volumes. Here was a man who truly knew the Roman Empire, from its distant, muddy frontier outposts, from the daily grind of harsh military life in a tent, all the way to the opulent, intricate dances of Roman politics within the marble halls of the Senate chamber. A man who understood the empire from the bottom up and the outside in. So how did this paragon of rectitude, this principled, unyielding figure, end up on the highly volatile, increasingly uncomfortable imperial throne? It all circles back, as so many troubles did in this period, to Emperor Commodus. Commodus was the wild, unstable, narcissistic son of the revered philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, a figure known for wisdom and stability. Commodus, however, spent his days performing bizarrely as a gladiator in the arena, believing he was the literal reincarnation of Hercules, even demanding statues portray him as such, and generally ruling like a very angry, unpredictably violent teenager given absolute supreme power over millions. Predictably, he became immensely unpopular with almost everyone of any influence, except maybe his closest, most sycophantic courtiers, and the actual gladiators he sparred with. On December 31st, 192 CE, on New Year's Eve, Commodus was finally assassinated, first poisoned by a disgruntled concubine, which didn't quite work. Perhaps the imperial chef didn't test it enough then, when that failed, strangled by a powerful wrestler. A surprisingly fitting end, one might say, for a wrestler-emperor obsessed with the arena. With Commodus conveniently spectacularly gone, Rome found itself in a sudden jarring political vacuum, utterly leaderless right on New Year's Eve. The conspirators, primarily his cunning praetorian prefect Latus and a shrewd chamberlain Eclectus, desperately needed a replacement, and fast. They definitely didn't want another loose cannon like Commodus. They needed someone respectable, someone stable, someone widely experienced, someone who could instantly calm the incredibly turbulent, choppy waters of Roman politics and society. Their eyes, perhaps tired and worried, landed with a hopeful glint on Pertinax. He was a trusted, deeply respected senior figure with immense public credibility, exactly what Rome desperately needed to avoid complete anarchy. So they rousted him from his bed, likely a rather undignified sudden awakening in the dead of night, and pretty much frog-marched him against his initial will to the Praetorian camp to be declared emperor. He was apparently rather profoundly reluctant at first, reportedly believing he was the very target of the assassination, and thinking it was a cruel, elaborate trick to lure him out of his house for immediate execution, which, in fairness, considering the perilous nature of Roman power, isn't a completely paranoid thought for a Roman statesman. Close your eyes, and just let that thought of a reluctant, worried man being propelled into power drift away. Upon reluctantly accepting this overwhelming responsibility, Pertinax, as custom dictated, promised the customary donativum to the mighty Praetorian Guard, a large symbolic bonus for recognizing him as their rightful emperor. He promised them 12,000 sesterces per man, about half what Julianus later promised in that outrageous auction, but still a genuinely huge sum far exceeding their annual salary. However, Pertinax was known throughout his career for his unwavering frugality and absolute honesty. His paramount goal was to stabilize Rome's collapsing finances after Commodus's utterly wild profligacy, which had effectively emptied the imperial treasury. This ambitious goal included the remarkably drastic measure of auctioning off much of Commodus's ridiculously expensive imperial trinkets, his collection of concubines, and even his beloved pet lions from the arena, much to the profound displeasure of those who had benefited lavishly from Commodus's outrageous excesses and corrupt system. This is a key mainstream historical fact. Pertinax, with unwavering conviction, attempted truly radical financial and moral reform, something Commodus's cronies, and more critically the Praetorians themselves, definitely did not appreciate or frankly permit. A truly quirky tidbit reflecting Pertinax's innovative but perhaps overly ambitious mindset. One of his significant reforms was to open up vast neglected imperial lands in Italy and permit anyone to farm them, granting them tax exemption for an unheard of 10 years, and giving them clear, undisputed property rights to those who claimed and developed the land productively. This was an incredibly progressive, almost socialist policy, an ancient land redistribution scheme aiming to dramatically boost agricultural output and settle displaced persons throughout the region. But it naturally immediately upset powerful landowners, prominent senators who preferred vast underutilized estates as symbols of their wealth and status, rather than as productive farms. It speaks volumes about his practical problem-solving approach to governance, born perhaps from his pragmatic teacher's mindset, always thinking of the greatest good, not always thinking of who would be offended. Allow this complex, quiet detail of history to wash over you, allowing your breath to become long and steady. However, his noble efforts at reform and uncompromising fiscal discipline were not universally welcomed, particularly not by the very Praetorian Guard he had just months earlier promised an enormous sum of money to. He tried to rein them in, stop their abuses, and curb their wildly excessive influence over imperial affairs. This austerity, this strict hand, coupled with a highly inconvenient and infuriatingly delayed payment of their enormous donativum, because he genuinely couldn't find the money Commodus had utterly squandered. Rome was broke, rubbed the Praetorians, the most powerful force in the city, the wrong way. The very wrong way. They were used to a free-for-all, to emperors buying their loyalty and then catering to their every whim. Pertinax was offering them discipline and stability, which surprisingly is apparently not what highly paid, notoriously undisciplined, self-serving soldiers always want when there's an easier, more lucrative path available. Historians still argue quietly in academic circles whether Pertinax's reforms were simply too abrupt, too ambitious, and too challenging for the deeply entrenched, utterly corrupt climate of the time, or if his ultimate failure was purely due to the unpredictable, bottomless greed of the Praetorian Guard, a force simply beyond anyone's true control. His earnest attempt to reform an entrenched, corrupt system, however well-intentioned and morally righteous, ultimately sealed his tragic doom, paving the way directly for the infamous imperial auction and the very emperors we just discussed. His name is barely a whisper now, lost in the shadows, but his actions reverberated with immense consequences. Let the softness of history fill your mind as you gently release all thoughts and anxieties. You remember Pertinax, that earnest, principled ex-teacher emperor who took over after Commodus's bizarre rule? His biggest problem wasn't an external enemy threatening the frontiers, or even the general Roman public, who for the most part respected his integrity and his efforts to bring stability. No, his fatal flaw, his most dangerous opponent, lay much closer to home, quite literally within the high walls of the Praetorian camp. Pertinax had an idea, a seemingly noble, entirely sensible one, that Rome desperately needed to balance its books after Commodus's outrageous unchecked profligate spending had left the treasury bare. This meant cutting down on the lavish, extravagant expenditure that had become commonplace, even normalized at the imperial court. And for the powerful Praetorian Guard, it meant reining in their excesses and demanding genuine military discipline, a shocking concept to them. You can almost hear the audible eye rolls and disdainful murmurs from those pampered, self-important guardsmen as they thought, "Discipline, we're the Praetorian Guard. Our discipline comes from our paychecks, from our lavish bonuses. Thank you very much. And we are accustomed to certain, shall we say, perks." His plan was in essence to stop treating the Praetorians like they were on a never-ending state-funded holiday bonus scheme. He systematically canceled illegal fees they demanded at the city gates, extorting bribes from merchants and travelers. He generally clamped down on their opportunistic swaggering and their abuse of civilian authority. He even, to their intense irritation, cut their special privileges, demanding that they return to active, proper training drills and duties, rather than just lounging around collecting protection money and shaking down honest citizens. Imagine someone taking away your personal parking spot, your extra long lunch break, and then perhaps worst of all, making you run drills in the stifling Roman heat after years of easy living. They were not thrilled, to put it mildly. The mainstream historical fact is undeniably clear. Pertinax's very short reign, while seen by many ordinary Romans and later historians as a sincere, desperate effort to restore Roman morality, integrity, and crucial fiscal sanity, primarily collapsed due to his inability, or perhaps more bravely, his courageous refusal to properly manage the Praetorian Guard's truly insatiable expectations and their sheer unadulterated avarice. A truly impossible task it would seem. Pertinax was attempting something truly monumental, something incredibly courageous to dismantle a deeply entrenched, utterly corrupt system of graft and privilege that had flourished and become normalized under emperors like Commodus. He was essentially telling an elite military unit, one that was dangerously accustomed to wielding political power and enjoying exorbitant privileges, that playtime was definitively over, and that duty, honor, and financial solvency for Rome came first. He was even bravely, transparently honest about the critical state's finances, publicly acknowledging that the imperial treasury was quite literally empty, drained by Commodus's wild spending. He struggled mightily to pay their promised donativum, their accession bonus, because as you remember, Commodus had basically squandered every sesterce in the empire's coffers. A portion was eventually paid, but the full enormous amount wasn't forthcoming quickly enough, and this crucial delay, this breach of their expectation, fueled a deep, dangerous resentment among the guards. It's like promising everyone a big holiday bonus, and then instead of cash handing them a slightly damp, very vague IOU note. Not great for morale, especially not for heavily armed men who effectively hold the reins of ultimate power in the capital. Now, a quirky little tidbit about these radical reforms of Pertinax he reportedly considered among his numerous desperate fiscal tightening measures, literally melting down the imperial silver plate, all the expensive decorative silverware and dinnerware used at the imperial banquets to pay for pressing state expenses. Think about it for a moment. A reigning emperor suggesting a giant symbolic pawn shop transaction, a fire sale of the imperial table settings just to balance the state budget. You can picture the treasury officials just wringing their hands in despair, probably thinking, "There goes my nice fancy diningware budget for the next 100 years." This intensely pragmatic, no-frills, almost brutally utilitarian approach to governance contrasted starkly with the opulence and excess the Praetorians and much of the elite had grown utterly accustomed to under Commodus. It certainly didn't win him any popularity contests in the highest echelons of society, or more importantly, with his own heavily armed bodyguard, the men who would literally determine his fate. Let that image of the gleaming, melting silver gently lull you towards peace. The frustration among the Praetorian Guard, that entitled spoiled unit, simmered, festered, and finally boiled over. It had barely been 3 short months since Pertinax had reluctantly taken the throne, since he had, through the most tenuous circumstances, assumed the imperial purple. You'd think even an unruly, greedy bunch would give a new boss, especially one trying to fix things, more time to settle and more time to figure out their chaotic financial situation. But they weren't in the mood for patience, not when their pockets were less full. They were deeply annoyed about the unpaid bonuses, tired of the newfound strict discipline, and frankly used to a much easier life of bribery and privilege. So on March 28th, 193 CE, a contingent of about 300 Praetorians, allegedly inflamed by one of their own tribunes, who had been recently reprimanded and humiliated by Pertinax for insubordination, suddenly violently burst into the sprawling imperial palace. Pertinax, always a man of remarkable composure, profound courage, and dignified presence, met them directly. He didn't flee, he didn't hide, he didn't send messengers. He stood his ground, seemingly attempting to reason with his teacher's voice with this armed mob of his own highly paid personal guard. Imagine the scene gently in your mind: an emperor just months into the job, standing face to face with a hostile armed mob, trying to talk them down, perhaps, with that very calm, rational, reasoned tone he used to use as a grammar school teacher, patiently explaining syntax to rambunctious children. He even started bravely arguing his case, pointing out that what he was doing was for the ultimate good of Rome, that he wasn't simply going to buy them off with money Rome desperately didn't have, unlike certain future emperors who would later attempt that very foolish strategy. Perhaps he was trying to shame them into obedience to appeal to a non-existent sense of honor. Or maybe he just felt that talking them out of outright rebellion was easier and certainly less messy than having an incredibly violent, incredibly sudden imperial death. And here's the truly tragic twist: it nearly worked. Many of the hardened soldiers hesitated, probably surprised by his calm courage, his dignified composure, and perhaps even swayed by his logical, truthful arguments. But amidst the hesitation, a disgruntled guard, more impulsive, more audacious, or perhaps more heavily emboldened than the rest, finally rushed forward and struck him down with a javelin, ending his very short, very honest, very impactful, brief reign. Others quickly followed a frenzy of violence until he was no more. One imagines in his final fading moments, he might have been thinking, "I really shouldn't have given up teaching. At least the kids in my class had some modicum of impulse control, or at least smaller weapons." Allow the solemnity of that image to gently lead you to rest. Pertinax's assassination plunged Rome back into a deeper, even more volatile state of chaos, setting the stage directly for the scandalous auction that Julianus so famously and so ignominiously won, which we just spoke about. His reign, lasting a mere 86 days, is a poignant, painful example of how difficult and dangerously fatal it was to introduce genuine reform into a deeply corrupt, utterly self-serving system that had become intimately comfortable with its power, its privileges, and its wealth. Historians still quietly argue whether Pertinax, despite his clearly good intentions, was politically naive in directly challenging the Praetorians' unassailable power and bottomless greed, or if their violent reaction was simply an inevitable, unavoidable response from a military force far too accustomed to their own unbridled power to tolerate any constraints or austerity from a principled leader. What's undeniably clear, etched in the echoes of time, is that his earnest, valiant efforts to reform the Praetorian Guard tragically sealed his fate and contributed to the subsequent profound instability that plagued the empire for decades. You can't fault him for trying, for truly believing in a better Rome, But you certainly can lament the complete and utter lack of historical precedent for effective imperial budgeting and imperial bodyguards who stayed loyal to a pay grade. Allow the ancient echoes to gently calm your spirit as you drift. And so we gently shift our focus from the chaotic reverberations of Pertinax's virtuous intentions and Julianus's disastrous acquisition to another even more tragic duo, whose desperate attempt at a shared throne born from profound desperation and a truly ill-advised gamble quickly ended in even greater and far more violent tragedy, taking them and their beautiful besieged city with them into the shadows of forgotten history. Just allow that thought to softly guide you deeper into quietude. So you've witnessed the empire for sale debacle of Didius Julianus, which was spectacularly sparked by the virtuous but ultimately doomed efforts of Emperor Pertinax. Rome in the immediate aftermath of Pertinax's assassination, and then the Julianus spectacle, was less a well-oiled, efficient governing machine, and more a dangerously wobbly cart on the verge of toppling over into a ditch, its wheels barely turning. The stability and order that Pertinax had so fervently yearned for and worked towards was a distant, almost forgotten dream, replaced by fear and uncertainty. In fact, after Julianus's brief, embarrassing stint at the helm, a truly terrifying emperor, a figure of immense physical prowess and unyielding brutality, seized the throne by force: Maximinus Thrax. Maximinus was not like Julianus with his banquets and bought power. Maximinus was a rough-and-tumble soldier rumored to be of Thracian peasant stock, standing over 8 feet tall, a brutal brawler who'd climbed the ranks purely through military might, brute force, and sheer intimidation. He literally was the concentrated brute force of the Roman army embodied in one terrifying figure. The Senate, Rome's old elite, hated him with an open, venomous passion. The people feared him with a primal, shuddering dread, and his heavy, unrelenting taxation to fund his armies and his constant frontier wars made absolutely everyone miserable and impoverished. This mainstream historical fact, Maximinus Thrax's utterly improbable rise from a simple provincial recruit to the most powerful man in Rome, purely through sheer physical prowess, unwavering ruthlessness, and terrifying military command, highlights a profound, brutal shift in imperial succession, far, far away from senatorial control, from ancient tradition, from gentle diplomacy. He wasn't interested in pomp and ceremony and intricate political dances. He was interested in iron discipline, crushing taxes, and ceaseless war, which, as you can imagine, didn't exactly endear him to the refined, well-dressed senators who constantly worried he might just casually trample them on his way to his next military campaign, or simply confiscate their villas to pay for his legions. The shadows deepened with his ascent. Now into this tyrannical, fear-soaked landscape steps an unlikely gentle pair of father and son, both rather confusingly named Gordian. This is not the ancient legend of the Gordian knot we talked about before. These are real, live, and very much Roman flesh and blood Gordians whose fate would be inextricably linked to Rome's ongoing turmoil. Gordian I, with his grand echoing name, Marcus Antonius Gordianus Sempronianus Romanus Africanus, was an old-school senator, a distinguished figure likely nearing 80 years old, with a widely known reputation for deep erudition, refined manners, and quiet wisdom. He had served a long and successful career in various important capacities across the empire, even becoming governor of the vast, incredibly prosperous province of Africa, a testament to his administrative skill. He wasn't a fiery revolutionary, not a man of immediate action, but a contemplative statesman far more comfortable in dusty libraries filled with scrolls, not chaotic battlefields filled with clanging swords. His son Gordian II, also known as Marcus Antonius Gordianus, was a young man only about 46, but still relatively young for the imperial throne, especially when compared to his aged venerable father. He too was a senator, though his historical reputation leans more towards being a lover of fine things a connoisseur of art and beauty, and an enjoyer of refined leisure, rather than a hard-nosed military man, a builder of armies, or a meticulous administrator. Imagine, if you will, if your very well-read and slightly tired grandfather suddenly had to take over a massive collapsing corporation, and your slightly less organized but far more stylish father became his very unwilling co-CEO. This whole venture already, even before it begins, sounds like it's destined for very high drama and perhaps inevitable heartbreak. The rebellion that unexpectedly brought them to power, bringing them into the full harsh glare of the imperial sun, didn't start with their own plotting or any grand scheme. Instead, it was a sudden, violent local uprising, a furious, desperate reaction to one of Maximinus's excessively cruel and brutally efficient tax collectors in the distant province of Africa. When this particular tax collector, notorious throughout the province for his relentless corruption and unfeeling brutality, arrived in the city of Thysdrus, the patient, long-suffering locals had simply had enough. They revolted, seizing their weapons, assassinating the hated tax collector on the spot, and then, fearing Maximinus's absolutely terrifying retribution, they turned to Gordian Vern, their revered proconsul, for leadership. They implored him, they demanded, insisted even, that he declare himself emperor, and bravely stand against the monstrous Maximinus Thrax. Gordian, given his advanced age, his gentle temperament, and his lifelong adherence to order and peaceful rule, was reportedly extremely profoundly reluctant. He cried, he pleaded, he tried every possible argument to demur, even theatrically threatening to throw himself from a window to avoid the crushing responsibility. He was an old man, happy with his scrolls, his quiet studies, and his peaceful life, suddenly tragically thrust into the very epicenter of a desperate, violent rebellion. You can almost hear him thinking, his gentle mind reeling, "I really should have just stayed home and read another volume about the Punic Wars. This, dear gods, is far, far too much excitement and danger for a man of my advanced years. Allow that quiet reluctance to soothe your mind." But the people of Thysdrus, those determined rebels, and eventually the highly influential figures in the capital of Africa, Carthage, were insistent, overwhelming him with their fervor. Faced with their sheer enthusiasm and the terrible, undeniable inevitability of Maximinus's brutal, overwhelming vengeance if they did not declare against him, Gordian, with a heavy sigh, finally relented. He insisted, however, that his beloved son Gordian II share the emperorship to give the new incredibly fragile regime an air of continuity of strength, and the vigor that his own advanced age might clearly lack. So, on March 19th, 238 CE, in a hastily arranged ceremony, they were proclaimed emperors in the ancient city of Carthage, with the fragile hope that their noble, illustrious lineage and the Senate's equally deep, festering loathing for Maximinus would miraculously rally the whole vast empire behind them. A fragile hope indeed. This unexpected, desperate act of rebellion sent seismic ripples across the entire Roman Empire. When the stunning news whispered on the wind finally reached Rome, the Senate, practically frothing at the mouth, with an intense, burning hatred for Maximinus Thrax, didn't hesitate for a single moment. They swiftly, decisively recognized Gordian I and II as legitimate emperors, going so far as to, with a dramatic flourish, declare Maximinus an explicit enemy of the state, a truly dramatic, incredibly dangerous move against a tyrannical soldier with massive legions. For the Senate, Rome's beleaguered elite, this was their chance, their final desperate gamble to rid themselves of the terrifying soldier emperor, and perhaps reclaim some shred of their ancient dignity and influence. It felt to them like a glorious, desperate last stand against overwhelming military might. There's a truly quirky tidbit about Gordian I hear reflecting his scholarly nature. He was famed during his lifetime for having a truly magnificent private library containing something like an astounding 62,000 volumes, making him a true unparalleled scholar, a man of letters. His accession to the imperial throne in that dramatic, urgent moment probably caused much frantic consternation amongst his loyal librarians, as his attention surely drastically shifted from meticulously cataloging ancient texts and contemplating philosophy to mapping urgent troop movements and counting meager coffers. And he had written poetry. Not exactly your typical rough-and-tumble soldier emperor, was he? Historians still quietly argue whether the Senate's enthusiastic immediate recognition of the Gordians was a genuine principled commitment to supporting a virtuous noble cause, or merely a profoundly pragmatic, terrifyingly desperate gamble against a brutal tyrant they knew deep in their hearts would ultimately purge them, wipe them out if given the chance to finally reach Rome. Perhaps a bit of both, a powerful cocktail of fear and aspiration. Let that thought gently quieten your mind. However, the Gordians' rebellion, despite the initial widespread desperate enthusiasm it generated, had a profound critical flaw, a fatal weakness right on its doorstep. Right next door to the prosperous province of Africa was the rugged province of Numidia, and its governor Capellianus was unfortunately a personal enemy of Gordian, having long harbored a festering grudge. And crucially, he was fiercely, undeniably loyal to Maximinus Thrax, a man who represented strength and decisive leadership to Capellianus. Capellianus commanded a single but powerful legion, Legio III Augusta, the only permanently stationed Roman legion in all of North Africa, making him the supreme, unchallenged military authority in the entire region. When the news of the Gordians' rebellion reached him, Maximinus's loyal governor Capellianus did not waver, not for a moment. He marshaled his forces, rallied his formidable legion, and immediately marched on Carthage, the heart of the rebellion. Gordian II, the son eager to prove himself worthy to make his mark as a young emperor and perhaps to save his aged father from direct battle, bravely led his father's army, comprised largely of local militias, untrained youths, and civic guard units, hardly a professional, battle-hardened army designed to fight a veteran legion. They were predictably utterly no match for a highly disciplined veteran Roman legion, forged in countless battles, whose soldiers were trained professionals. In the ensuing incredibly short and utterly devastating battle outside Carthage, Gordian II was tragically violently killed. Seeing his beloved son dead on the field and his desperate rebellion utterly crushed Gordian, and barely a month into his unexpected brief emperorship was overwhelmed by profound despair and inconsolable grief. He quietly, perhaps with one last look at the sky, hanged himself. The brief flame of rebellion, as the outline promised the noble cause, was tragically extinguished in a matter of mere weeks, burning out as quickly as it began. The once proud city of Carthage was utterly devastated by Capellianus's victorious legions, as he took ruthless, comprehensive revenge for the uprising, stripping the city of its wealth and its dignity. And so within just 36 short days of being proclaimed co-emperors, both Gordians were dead, extinguished from the imperial stage. Their rebellion, though incredibly short-lived, exposed the utter profound fragility of the Roman Empire, and highlighted the terrible dangers of confronting powerful military figures like Maximinus Thrax, without substantial legions of your own, without true battle-ready might. Their story is a stark, quiet reminder that noble intentions, scholarly wisdom, senatorial backing, and even widespread popular support were simply not enough when confronted by an armed, ruthless, and unyielding military opposition. The Senate, having recklessly backed the losing side, having put all its chips on the Gordians, now found themselves in an even more precarious, horrifying position, staring down the full, unbridled wrath of the very tyrant they had dared to defy. They needed a plan, a desperate Hail Mary, and they needed it blindingly fast to avoid the brutal, merciless purges they knew were coming with chilling certainty from the monstrous Maximinus Thrax. This overwhelming, profound desperation would lead them to a truly odd and frankly very surprising solution, something completely unprecedented. Allow your mind to drift on this soft whisper of desperation as sleep draws closer. So you've witnessed the brief, heart-wrenching, and truly tragic saga of the Gordians, two emperors. One an elderly, quiet scholar, the other, his pleasure-loving yet still courageous son, whose noble though ill-conceived rebellion against the monstrous Maximinus Thrax ended in quick, utterly devastating defeat. The Roman Senate, having staked everything on the Gordians' improbable success, was now truly undeniably between a rock and a very large, extremely angry, barbarian-blooded hard place. Maximinus Thrax, upon hearing the triumphant news of the Gordians' swift deaths, was ecstatic, filled with a vengeful fury. He was already rapidly marching on Rome with his legions driven by an unholy vengeance, eager to unleash his battle-hardened armies on the very senators who had dared so foolishly to declare him an enemy of the state. Imagine, if you will, a school bully 10 times stronger and more brutal than everyone else combined. Suddenly realizing the smaller, weaker kids who just tried to pick on him had failed spectacularly. Now he's coming back for them full of wrath, his intentions chillingly clear. This was a moment of profound, undeniable existential crisis for the Roman Senate. They couldn't simply declare allegiance to Maximinus, or pledge fealty after publicly condemning him after going so far as to label him an enemy of the state. They had literally made their bed, and now it quite distinctly smelled of impending, very painful doom. Their only desperate hope, their final gambit, was to find new emperors, and they needed them right now, literally in days, to stand against Maximinus, and crucially to protect themselves from his coming vengeance. But who? They needed someone with legitimacy, someone who could instantly galvanize widespread support, and crucially someone who absolutely did not come from Maximinus's intimidating military background. The mainstream historical fact etched in the very fabric of this chaotic era is that in 238 CE, the Roman Senate, in an unprecedented, almost unbelievable move, bypassed tradition, circumvented military approval entirely, and elected 2 of its own members, 2 civilians, as co-emperors. This bold, almost suicidal decision underscored the sheer depth of their fear, their absolute desperation, and their very faint, fading hope to assert their ancient authority against a truly tyrannical general who held all the military cards. Their choices, given the overwhelming pressure and dire stakes, were curious, perhaps even contradictory. First, they picked Decimus Caelius Calvinus Balbinus. Balbinus was a distinguished senator, an old-line aristocrat with a long, impeccable, and highly respected career in public service. He had served as a consul, twice been governor of various provinces across the empire, and was known for his elegant oratorical skills, his cultured bearing, and his generally dignified, almost scholarly demeanor. Think of him as the consummate Roman political insider, perhaps a bit soft around the edges, lacking direct military command, but utterly respectable, deeply connected to Rome's oldest traditions. Then they chose Marcus Clodius Pupienus Maximus. Pupienus, by stark contrast, had a far more robust, more practical background, even if he too was of senatorial rank. He was a truly capable soldier and a shrewd administrator who had served as a provincial governor and a tough city prefect, even successfully battling fiercely against Germanic tribes on the northern frontier, demonstrating his military acumen. He was tougher, more disciplined, and certainly had far more relevant military experience than the urbane Balbinus. He also had a widely known reputation for sternness, sometimes a little asterisk too. Asterisk stern, a rigid disposition which, as we shall see, would inevitably cause internal friction and tragically fatal consequences. The decision to choose 2 co-emperors, 2 equals from their own ranks, simultaneously was incredibly unusual, almost an act of administrative fantasy. It was a clear theoretical attempt at division of labor, Pupienus, the more military man, would take charge of defending Italy and leading the armies against Maximinus' marshalling forces, while Balbinus, the refined administrator, would stay firmly rooted in Rome, managing civil affairs, keeping the peace, and crucially dealing with the temperamental Senate itself. It sounded good on paper, a perfect combination of raw brawn and sophisticated brains, of rigid discipline and elegant diplomacy. What in this perfectly rational, theoretically sound setup could possibly go wrong? Well, immediately, almost instantaneously, the massive crowd in Rome, the general populace, didn't quite agree with the Senate's excellent new plan, their supposedly ideal solution. When Pupienus and Balbinus were being escorted to the venerable capital to be formally proclaimed, the public erupted. The citizens weren't enthusiastic, not a single bit. They were deeply worried, terrified, in fact, that with two purely senatorial emperors, neither of whom truly commanded significant loyal armies, not yet anyway, the Senate would simply get trampled, squashed like a grape by Maximinus' Thrax, and they, the common people, would be left even more exposed to his brutal wrath. Their main gripe, the public's very strong, very loud quirk here, was that the new emperors didn't include a representative from the family they'd just mourned, the noble Gordians, a family they had briefly passionately adored. They started throwing stones, and whatever objects came to hand, creating an angry din demanding a representative of the beloved and recently deceased Gordian line, a symbol of their defiance to Maximinus. You can almost hear them chanting the rhythmic demanding roar from the agitated crowds. "Give us a Gordian, give us a Gordian." Let that chant gently quieten as you sink deeper. This wasn't a small, polite protest. This was an outright riot, a truly terrifying, chaotic explosion of public anger. The people in their fury and fear surrounded the newly proclaimed emperors, creating an impassable human blockage in the narrow Roman streets. In an incredibly revealing display of profound desperation, quick thinking, and raw appeasement, Pupienus and Balbinus, likely realizing that their tenuous, newly acquired hold on power was already incredibly fragile, rushed back to the safety of the Senate chamber. In an instant, in a decision driven by panic, they elevated the youngest member of the Gordian family, the quiet, unsuspecting 9-year-old Gordian III, the grandson of the elderly Gordian I, to the rank of Caesar. He wasn't quite emperor yet, but this incredibly elevated title meant he was the heir apparent, the designated successor, securing the Roman public's critical favor, and instantly granting legitimacy, at least in the eyes of the populace, to the new, utterly fragile regime. This desperate measure quickly calmed the raging rioters, an almost unbelievable reminder that in Roman politics, sometimes a small, strategically appointed, utterly bewildered child is all it takes to avert immediate disaster, or at least to postpone it for a very short while. Historians still gently argue whether this impulsive emergency elevation of Gordian III was a brilliant unifying political maneuver to unify broad support against a common enemy, or simply an instinctive, desperate act of pure panic born from their already tenuous grasp on power. Given the harrowing circumstances, the intense pressure, it was probably a significant, complicated bit of both. So now Rome has not one, not two, but confusingly 3 emperors at least in name, the 2 Senate-picked senior emperors, the soldier Pupienus and the aristocrat Balbinus, and a child Caesar Gordian III as their designated, widely popular successor. A truly peculiar, deeply unstable situation for a crumbling empire, facing a massive barbarian strongman threat, marching relentlessly towards its very heart. Allow this complex picture to dissolve into the quiet depths of your mind. Pupienus, the tougher, more militarily inclined of the 2 senior emperors, promptly, resolutely set off from Rome to confront the lumbering, terrifying Maximinus Thrax. Maximinus, meanwhile supremely confident in his overwhelming military strength, was slowly, deliberately making his brutal way down to Italy, expecting an easy, immediate conquest. He was sure he would quickly brush aside any resistance. But to his profound irritation and the empire's unexpected fortune, he ran into unexpectedly fierce resistance at Aquileia, a heavily fortified city in northern Italy that crucially courageously refused to open its gates to him. The siege of Aquileia became unexpectedly prolonged, agonizingly difficult, and utterly messy, as Aquileia proved to be a far more formidable obstacle than Maximinus had ever anticipated. Maximinus's troops, already tired from the long, hard march, running short on vital supplies, and increasingly resentful of the arduous, unending campaign under their harsh leader, grew deeply restless. Their patience, which had been stretched paper-thin under Maximinus's brutal leadership anyway, finally snapped utterly catastrophically. In a dramatic, violent mutiny, Maximinus, along with his son, whom he had elevated as his co-emperor, was savagely assassinated by his very own Praetorian guards them again. It seems they had a remarkably effective, if violent, internal HR department for emperor removal, who frankly seemed to specialize in emperor removal when things got inconveniently tough. The mutinous soldiers severed their heads, put them on tall poles as a grotesque warning, and triumphantly brought them back to Rome, not as grim trophies, but as universally welcomed powerful signs of immense public relief, finally removing the imminent terrible threat to the very survival of the city. A terrible yet welcome end. Pupienus, after the electrifying news reached him that Maximinus was definitively dead, his threat vanquished, marched triumphantly back to Rome, a hero returning from the frontier. You'd think this would naturally lead to joyous celebrations, to lasting peace, and to the immediate, unwavering cementing of his and Balbinus's rightful rule, finally uniting the empire under competent senatorial leadership. But alas, no. Instead, almost immediately upon their theoretical triumph, they swiftly began to demonstrate a very different kind of crippling incompetence, internal personal animosity. While they were a seemingly perfect match in theory chosen for their complementary strengths in practice, they immediately began to squabble, to bicker incessantly like ill-tempered, overgrown children. Pupienus, fresh from leading armies, from winning a very messy proxy war through indirect means, became openly jealous of Balbinus, who had stayed in Rome managing things relatively smoothly, conducting senatorial affairs, and presumably receiving more public credit, more flattery from the Roman elite, and the public who adored a civilian in power. Balbinus in turn deeply resented Pupienus's military swagger, his sometimes rough, imperious manners, and subtly continuously suspected that Pupienus, with his direct military experience and battlefield command, was secretly trying to assert sole undisputed command for himself. You can practically hear the petty, relentless squabbling escalating in the imperial dining halls. Or rather, since they were probably too intensely irritated to even share a meal, the endless stream of passive-aggressive scathing notes passed back and forth between their separate imperial wings. The gentle sarcasm, the historians dryly say of their relationship, was a constant, sharp knife edge, threatening to sever their tenuous partnership at any moment. This very specific quirk, that they literally disliked each other so intensely, so profoundly, they couldn't even stand to dine together or occupy the same parts of the lavish imperial palace for extended periods, became legendary, a widely whispered testament to their crippling animosity. An animosity that quickly spread like a noxious gas through the entire court and permeated their very brief reign. They made even the most notoriously awkward family reunions look calm, friendly, and utterly serene. Pass the salt, you overly dramatic, pompous senator. I shall not, you arrogant, overbearing general, until you apologize for claiming my victory over Maximinus Thrax. This internal friction, this relentless squabbling fueled by wounded pride, intense distrust, and insatiable ambition, would prove to be a far more insidious, dangerous enemy than the colossal Maximinus Thrax ever was. and it sealed their fates in a particularly dramatic, ignominious, and frankly quite pathetic manner. Let the fading echoes of their absurd arguments softly carry you to slumber. You've just witnessed the extinguishing of the Gordians' brief, noble, and ultimately tragic flame of rebellion. The valiant death of Gordian II in battle followed almost immediately by the elderly Gordian Theban's profound despair and heartbreaking suicide, marked an absolutely brutal end to their brave, if perhaps ill-conceived and poorly armed challenge to the brutal tyranny of Maximinus Thrax. This was a rebellion born of overwhelming desperation, fervent popular courage, and noble intentions. But it utterly, fatally lacked the professional military force the legions necessary to see it through to ultimate victory against a trained, brutal army. The immediate aftermath for the wealthy province of Africa was utterly devastating. Capellianus Maximinus's loyal, vengeful governor of Numidia, and the man who had crushed the rebellion with his forces, brought his ruthless legion Legio III Augusta into Carthage, the former heart of the revolt. The proud city was mercilessly sacked, its beautiful property was brutally seized, its most prominent citizens were summarily executed, and those who had bravely supported the Gordians paid a heavy price in blood and in treasure. It was a stark, chilling, and undeniably painful reminder of the absolute ruthlessness of Maximinus, and the profound folly of crossing him without overwhelming force, without a guarantee of success. You can almost feel the chilling dread that would have gripped the hearts of anyone in Rome who had openly supported the ill-fated, short-lived Gordians, wondering when the retribution would come for them. The mainstream historical fact about this harrowing period is the truly brutal, unyielding suppression of any perceived opposition by Maximinus Thrax. His retribution, his punishment was swift and overwhelmingly severe. An undeniable public warning to any other provincial governor, any other Roman senator who might have considered defying him. The flickering hope that the Gordians had briefly ignited across Rome and other rebellious provinces simply sputtered out, extinguished, replaced by a cold, numbing dread, an icy certainty that Maximinus would extract his bloody revenge. For the Roman Senate, that ancient powerful body who had so publicly, so dramatically sided with the Gordians, and so brazenly declared Maximinus an explicit enemy of the state, this crushing defeat was not just a setback, it was a death sentence waiting imminently to be executed. Maximinus was now rapidly, furiously marching towards Italy with his battle-hardened legions, surely inevitably intent on enacting a bloody, thorough purge, wiping out everyone who had dared to oppose him. The Roman elite were quite literally facing oblivion, facing complete extinction, having made an irreversible, deeply perilous choice. They probably wished they could, with a magical sigh, crawl under the nearest senatorial table and simply disappear into the marble floor or evaporate into the humid Roman air. Allow the quiet weight of that historical fear to gently pass, leading you to calmness. Consider the atmosphere, the palpable dread in Rome during this truly terrifying time. The ordinary citizens had, with a burst of joyous enthusiasm, cheered the Gordians, embracing them, however briefly, as saviors, as symbols of liberation from Maximinus's suffocating tyranny. Now the news of their spectacular, quick defeat, their violent deaths, would have swept through the bustling, fearful city, like a destructive wildfire, leaving fear and panic in its wake. Fear would have immediately turned into outright uncontrollable panic. What would Maximinus, that human beast, do when he finally inevitably reached Rome's ancient gates? Would he leave anyone standing? Would there be mercy for anyone? The mood must have been utterly frantic. Far worse, far more terrifying than the disappointment of a missed gladiatorial spectacle, a very grave matter in Roman life. This harrowing moment highlighted the severe, critical structural weakness of the Roman Empire popular support. Even the august decree of the Roman Senate meant very little in the grand scheme of things if you didn't at the end of the day directly command and control battle-hardened legions. It's like a massive corporate takeover. where one side has a really great noble business plan, and the other side just has all the heavily armed, highly dangerous security guards who do exactly what they're told. There's a quirky tidbit about Maximinus Thrax during this brutal, relentless advance on Rome. He was so intensely focused on reaching Rome, on achieving his revenge, on utterly crushing his enemies, that he apparently pushed his massive army mercilessly, relentlessly, often making the march for days and days without adequate rest, without proper provisions, enduring severe hardship. This brutal pace, this driving obsession would later backfire, of course, leading directly to resentment and outright unrest among his already weary troops. But at this particular moment, for the senators and citizens in Rome, it only amplified the raw primal terror. Imagine Maximinus screaming, his voice echoing over dusty roads. "Faster, I have purges, glorious purges to attend to in Rome," as his exhausted, starving soldiers shuffled along, fearing his wrath more than the march. This brutal efficiency only cemented the Senate's growing conviction, their chilling certainty, that they had to find a new solution, and they needed to find it somehow incredibly quickly. Let the image of their frantic urgency soften and fade from your mind's eye. Faced with this overwhelming, desperate situation, with Maximinus approaching Rome day by terrifying day, the Roman Senate convened in a series of urgent secret sessions, the marble halls perhaps echoing with hushed, anxious whispers. They debated furiously, no doubt with trembling hands, with very short, frayed tempers, and with profound exhaustion clouding their minds. Retreat was utterly impossible. Appeasement, given their earlier defiance, was equally lethally so. Their only remaining course of action was to somehow replace the deceased Gordians, and then immediately prepare a defense, any defense, against the looming, terrifying approach of Maximinus. This required an unprecedented act of defiance, an almost suicidal show of their fading authority. They needed emperors, multiple emperors, and they needed them with a terrifying urgency. This brings us to a major ongoing scholarly debate. How much did the profound desperation and imminent palpable threat of Maximinus genuinely shape the Senate's utterly unique, unprecedented decision to choose two of their own, Balbinus and Pupienus, and then to elevate the widely loved, very young Gordian III? Some historians argue gently in academic circles that it was purely reactive and desperate survival mechanism born of overwhelming panic, a last-ditch effort. Others suggest it was a carefully calculated political gambit, a long-game strategy to reclaim senatorial prestige, and perhaps at long last break the dangerous, seemingly endless cycle of military strongmen violently seizing power, regardless of the incredibly slim odds of success. Given the sudden and brutal demise of their previous champions, the Gordians, it likely contained a huge, intoxicating dose of sheer, unadulterated fear, mixed with a sliver of daring, last-gasp opportunism. It was a Hail Mary pass in the dying seconds of a very grim game. Allow the complex interplay of fear and desperate hope to gently calm your thoughts, bringing you deeper relaxation. So out of this utter swirling chaos, out of this overwhelming existential threat, the Senate made their desperate choice, the decision that would decide Rome's immediate fate. As you heard, they bravely, though perhaps foolishly, elected two emperors from their very own ranks. Both respectable figures in their own right, steeped in senatorial tradition. But critically, neither possessed direct, overwhelming military command or personal armies capable of fighting a major war. Balbinus, the refined aristocrat, and Pupienus, the more practical soldier-turned-administrator, were formally appointed to govern this rapidly spiraling, increasingly fragmented empire. And then, because the agitated Roman populace wouldn't have it any other way after the sad, poignant end of the Gordians, they also elevated the innocent young Gordian III to the rank of Caesar, sealing his destiny. A truly peculiar Senate-appointed imperial trio. What you might quietly ask, could possibly go wrong with a complex, potentially bickering combination of two aging senior citizens and a 9-year-old on the world stage attempting to govern an empire facing existential threats on every frontier? The next stage of their chaotic joint reign, of course, would see the internal squabbles between the two adult co-emperors almost immediately overshadow any lingering pressing external threats. The subtle sound of their disagreements begins to fade, guiding you towards deep sleep. So Maximinus Thrax, the behemoth soldier emperor, that terrifying tyrant who had marched on Rome bringing fiery retribution for the Senate's audacious support of the fallen Gordians, was finally irrevocably dealt with. You remember him, that formidable, brutal figure. Well, thanks to the incredibly frustrating bogged-down siege of Aquileia, which drained his resources and morale, and his own army's severe exhaustion and simmering uncontrollable discontent, he was finally done for. His own Praetorian Guard in a classic Roman military mutiny. You'd think they'd have a stronger HR department by now for this kind of thing, given its frequent occurrence had brutally assassinated him and his son. Good riddance, you might think, good riddance to that bloody tyrant. For the senators huddled in Rome, having desperately picked Balbinus and Pupienus as their unlikely co-emperors, the news of Maximinus's demise must have arrived like a cool, refreshing sip of water, after a scorching, exhausting run utterly transforming their precarious situation from hopeless terror to immediate palpable relief. Pupienus, the tougher, more militarily experienced of the two senatorial choices, had been marching northward from Rome to confront Maximinus's advancing army. Upon receiving the stunning news, he didn't even need to fight a single battle. Maximinus was already a headless, utterly defanged former emperor, his threat completely neutralized. Pupienus, filled with a sense of triumph and relief, returned to Rome, marching through its ancient gates, hailed with a newfound enthusiasm as a liberator. Imagine the grand, spontaneous parade, the joyous shouts, the genuine sense of immense public relief that Maximinus's brutal reign was finally truly over, that the direct threat to the city was no more. The Roman people who had just rioted days before demanding a Gordian were now genuinely thrilled, for the immediate existential threat was gone. For the first time in a while, perhaps years, it felt like Rome had been truly delivered from a significant threat thanks to a courageous Senate-backed military response, however indirect and lucky. The mainstream historical fact here is that this collective action by the Senate, culminating in their active, desperate involvement in defending the state through their chosen emperors, albeit indirectly with Maximinus's own discontented troops, doing the bloody dirty work, represented a profound, almost singular moment in Roman history. It marked the pinnacle of senatorial power and influence in imperial succession, perhaps the last true gasp of its institutional strength and courage for a very, very long time, as it demonstrated an ancient civilian assembly, openly defying and outmaneuvering powerful military strongmen, even if just for a fleeting moment. Let the faint echo of the crowd's cheering gentle lull you to rest. You'd think, wouldn't you, with the terrifying existential threat from Maximinus finally gone, and the capital breathing a massive sigh of collective relief, that Pupienus and Balbinus, the Senate's grand solution, would at last unite and consolidate their rule, basking in their shared success. They even had a child emperor-to-be in the 9-year-old Gordian III, who was designed to secure popular legitimacy and smooth public acceptance. What else in this new era of relative peace could possibly go wrong? Plenty. Oh, so much could go wrong. It seems they collectively forgot the cardinal rule of Roman imperial partnership: shared power usually inevitably leads to spectacular, often bloody implosion. Pupienus and Balbinus simply could not get along. Their fundamental personality differences, which had been momentarily overlooked, or perhaps even optimistically seen as complementary, when a huge, hairy barbarian emperor was pounding on Rome's gates, now became massive, utterly irreconcilable fissures, widening into a dangerous chasm. Pupienus, the more practical military man, felt that Balbinus, the refined, somewhat effeminate civilian, was simply too soft. Too bureaucratic, too caught up in luxurious comfort, and perhaps unforgivably took too much credit for Rome's liberation when he'd been back in the capital signing parchments and sipping fine wine. Balbinus, on the other hand, deeply resented Pupienus's military swagger, his sometimes rough soldierly manners, and subtly increasingly suspected that Pupienus, with his direct military experience and proven command, was slyly secretly trying to assert sole absolute command for himself and marginalize Balbinus completely. You can practically hear the petty bitter squabbling escalating in the imperial dining halls, or rather, since they were probably too intensely irritated to even share a meal, the endless scathing passive-aggressive notes passed back and forth between their separate luxurious imperial wings. The gentle sarcasm, the historians dryly famously say of their relationship, was a constant sharp knife edge, threatening to sever their tenuous partnership at any moment. This rather specific quirk that they literally disliked each other so intensely, so profoundly, they couldn't even stand to dine together or occupy the same parts of the palace for extended periods, became legendary in Rome, a widely whispered testament to their crippling animosity. An animosity that quickly spread like a toxic, noxious gas through the entire imperial court and permeated their very brief reign. They made even the most notoriously awkward, tension-filled family reunions look calm, friendly, and utterly serene. Pass the salt, you overly dramatic, pompous senator. I shall not, you arrogant, overbearing general, until you apologize for claiming my victory over Maximinus Thrax. This profound internal friction, this ceaseless squabbling between the emperors themselves, had far more insidious, dangerous long-term consequences than the direct military threat posed by Maximinus. Historians still quietly argue whether their personal antagonism directly paved the way for even more future political instability and contributed significantly to the larger all-consuming crisis of the 3rd century, or if their deeply flawed bickering personalities merely highlighted existing systemic weaknesses that would have inevitably surfaced anyway. Their mutual disdain surely didn't help. Let the gentle whispers of their bickering softly quiet your mind. The one entity that particularly loved, indeed relished, this imperial squabbling was, of course, the venerable, omnipresent Praetorian Guard. Remember them. The guys who literally sold the emperorship, then brutally killed Pertinax, then assassinated Maximinus. They're practically the running gag, the persistent theme of Roman political assassinations during this era. The guards had resented the appointment of Balbinus and Pupienus from the very start, as it deliberately curtailed their lucrative, often arbitrary king-making role. And the continuous bickering, the endless public disputes between the two emperors, just made them seem profoundly weak and utterly unstable, easy targets for removal. The Praetorians wanted an emperor they could completely control, a pliable figurehead. Or at least one who wouldn't be so busy squabbling with his co-ruler that he forgot to keep them sweet with generous cash bonuses and lavish privileges. They feared with increasing certainty that one of the emperors, if they finally decisively won their tedious internal feud, might ultimately dismantle their cherished influence, their vast power, just as the ill-fated Pertinax had bravely tried to. And what, my dear listeners, does a powerful Praetorian Guard do when it feels insecure, disrespected, or finds an emperor simply annoying? It often quite decisively finds a new employer. Their suspicions and their plotting peaked when unsettling news arrived that fearsome Gothic tribes were relentlessly ravaging parts of the empire's northern frontier, requiring immediate military action. Pupienus, perhaps trying to assert his military dominance, or genuinely trying to protect Rome, announced he would personally lead an army to deal with them, leaving Balbinus predictably in charge of Rome. This raised huge alarm bells among the Praetorians. What if Pupienus came back from a successful military campaign and tried to depose Balbinus, seizing sole absolute emperorship for himself? Or what if Balbinus used the opportunity of Pupienus's absence to gain sole power himself, purging Pupienus's supporters? The guards weren't waiting around to find out who would ultimately win the Roman Empire's ultimate awkward roommate situation. During the Grand Capitoline Games in July 238 CE, a major public festival meant to be a moment of Roman public unity celebration and distracting spectacle, the Praetorians shrewdly seized their chance, sensing the perfect moment. The Roman public was largely distracted, eyes fixed on the festivities, on the chariot races, on the gladiatorial combats, the general revelry filling the city squares. A significant portion of the Praetorian Guard simply brutally stormed the imperial palace, the very heart of the bickering, paralyzed empire. They found both Pupienus and Balbinus arguing as usual, voices raised in bitter dispute in a private imperial chamber, presumably still unable to agree on even the smallest administrative detail. Their personal guards, legionaries who had escorted Pupienus from the north and were loyal to him, were off duty, or mingling innocently with the crowds, utterly unable to defend their emperors in the sudden chaos. Without any serious concerted resistance, the Praetorians dragged the bickering emperors naked through the public streets. A shocking display of contempt subjected them to various humiliating torments, and then without ceremony murdered them in front of the Praetorian barracks, leaving their bodies as a grim lesson. In their short, ignominious demise, these ambitious senatorial emperors, chosen by a desperate senate, starkly highlighted how destructive internal divisions, personal animosity, and insatiable pride could be just as fatal as overwhelming external enemies, and perhaps even more pathetic to witness. With Pupienus and Balbinus, those perpetually bickering co-rulers, gone, the throne was once again violently vacant, leaving behind a profound power vacuum and a very confused, bewildered child, Caesar, the quiet Gordian III, setting the stage for his rather unexpected and historically very short reign. Let the echoes of the Capitol begin to quiet, preparing you for deep slumber. You remember our perpetually bickering duo, Balbinus and Pupienus, the Roman Senate's last desperate hope against the monstrous Maximinus Thrax. Well, their deep personal animosity, that festering mutual dislike, coupled with the ever-present, ever-dangerous volatility of the Praetorian Guard, ultimately proved fatal. They were dragged through the streets of Rome, publicly murdered, and now Rome once again found itself without a definitive adult ruler, leaving the field surprisingly clear for our next short-term, wonderfully obscure emperor, the quiet, unsuspecting 9-year-old Gordian III. Yes, the very same child Caesar, whose earlier unexpected elevation had soothed the angry Roman mob when Pupienus and Balbinus were initially proclaimed. He'd gone from being a mere political appeasement, a useful symbolic gesture, to the accidental emperor of the known world, thrust onto the very throne he was merely meant to inherit one day. Talk about an unexpected, utterly daunting promotion, especially when you're still trying to master long division and probably worried about what toys your new office might contain. When the Praetorians, those perpetual kingmakers, having so efficiently disposed of their bickering co-emperors, emerged from their barracks, swords likely still stained, they presented young Gordian III to the excited, rather relieved crowds. The young boy was now very much in charge, at least nominally. The Roman people cheered with a joyous enthusiasm, thrilling to have a return of the popular and now somewhat romanticized Gordian line after so much brutal chaos. He was naturally far too young to actually rule in any meaningful sense, of course, but his revered lineage provided a desperately needed sense of continuity and stability, at least symbolically a balm to the fractured empire. This mainstream historical fact, the Praetorian Guard directly choosing a child as emperor, elevating him not based on his experience or military prowess, but on the strength of broad public acclaim, and then swiftly removing any real adult rivals illustrates their evolving audacious kingmaker role, prioritizing malleability, ease of control over traditional legitimacy, military experience, or any real effective governance. For a brief, terrifying, bewildering moment, it truly seemed they had complete and utter control over the direction of the Roman Empire, a child in their grasp. Allow the distant sound of gentle cheering to guide you deeper into calm. Being quite precisely 9 years old, Gordian III was obviously not running the imperial show himself. For the first few years of his reign, a form of carefully constructed regency council was put in place. These were leading senators and trusted advisors who theoretically guided him through the complex world of imperial governance, making the decisions. However, real tangible power, the true reins of the empire, lay unmistakably with the Praetorian prefect Timesitheus, a formidable, unyielding figure. Timesitheus was an Easterner of Syrian origin, a man of exceptional intelligence, keen cunning, and importantly, he was fiercely loyal to Gordian and the long-term stability of the entire empire. He was also significantly Gordian's father-in-law, a clever traditional way of securing personal loyalty and cementing power in ancient Rome, because if your family was firmly in charge, you were likely very, very invested in its continuing success. Timesitheus basically served as the de facto emperor, ruling the vast empire, managing everything from complex foreign policy and daring military campaigns to intricate civil administration, allowing the child emperor to focus on, well, being a child emperor, which mostly involved being present at grand ceremonies, offering symbolic sacrifices, and probably looking suitably regal and innocent. This brings us to a rather endearing, quirky tidbit about this unusual imperial setup. While Timesitheus was running the colossal empire with an iron fist and formidable competence quietly behind the scenes, young Gordian III continued to enjoy the sincere adoration of the Roman people, who simply loved his youthful, innocent presence after the turbulent, often violent reigns of the adult strongmen and the incessantly bickering senators. He reportedly was tutored by eminent scholars and respected poets, living a surprisingly normal for an emperor childhood, learning Latin Greek rhetoric, and all the things a well-bred, intellectually curious Roman aristocrat would learn. It seems he was actually quite intelligent and genuinely eager to learn despite his accidental, dramatic path to power. You can imagine his bewildered tutors quietly fretting over how to delicately explain the recent brutal assassinations and violent usurpations without completely traumatizing their impressionable imperial charge. "Yes, Caesar," they might whisper with great care. "Sometimes powerful people have deeply regrettable disagreements that unfortunately involve javelins and sharp political ambition. Now back to your verb conjugations." Gordian III's reign, which lasted a surprising 6 years, and remarkably long time for this volatile, unpredictable period in Roman history, was generally seen as relatively stable, peaceful and competent, thanks almost entirely to Timesitheus's astute, unwavering leadership. Under his expert guidance, Rome engaged in successful, decisive campaigns against its primary threats. Most notably, they decisively pushed back against the mighty Sassanid Persian Empire, which had become a major aggressive threat in the east, relentlessly raiding Roman provinces and even seizing important Roman cities. This was a truly significant achievement, something many adult emperors had struggled and failed to accomplish. The disciplined Roman army under Timesitheus advanced deep into Persian territory, regaining lost ground and securing key, undeniable victories. It seemed for a precious few years that Rome had miraculously found a truly competent, stabilizing manager in Timesitheus, and a beloved unifying figurehead in the young Gordian III, to lead them out of the seemingly endless, debilitating tumult of the crisis of the 3rd century. A glimmer of hope indeed. However, Roman history, as we've regretfully learned, rarely follows a smooth, uncomplicated upward trajectory for very long, especially not in this chaotic century. In 243 CE, during one of the successful but arduous campaigns against the Sassanids in the distant east, time Scythius, the capable Praetorian prefect suddenly and mysteriously died. Historians still argue whether his sudden death was from entirely natural causes, perhaps a lingering illness exacerbated by the harsh campaign conditions, or if he was far more sinisterly conveniently poisoned by his own troops, or more likely by ambitious rivals seeking to remove his formidable presence. There's a strong pervasive suspicion that his successor Philip the Arab had a very deliberate hand in it, eliminating the most formidable obstacle to his own soaring ambitions. It's certainly a remarkably convenient death, a little too neat. This unresolved question leaves us still wondering even centuries later about the dark, murky underbelly of Roman power, where loyalty was often conditional, fleeting, and ruthless ambition knew no bounds. Allow the quiet whispers of unresolved mystery to drift around you. With time Scythius, his wise and capable regent, abruptly gone, the now 19-year-old Gordian III, no longer truly a child, found himself suddenly utterly alone, navigating the treacherous waters of imperial politics without his guide. He had grown up sheltered by his regent's expert guidance, and crucially, he deeply lacked direct military experience or any strong influential political allies of his own within the complex Roman court. His new Praetorian prefect Gaius Julius Priscus, a man of cunning ambition, quickly appointed his own brother Marcus Julius Philippus, far better known as Philip the Arab, as co-prefect, effectively sharing ultimate command of the powerful guard. Philip was a pragmatic, ruthless, and highly ambitious man who had started as a minor equestrian, rising through the ranks much like many of the career military men we've seen ascend through sheer cunning ruthlessness and innate ability rather than noble birth. Philip quickly maneuvered with silent precision to undermine Gordian's already tenuous authority. During the ongoing difficult Persian campaign, the Roman army suffered a crippling supply shortage, a shortage which Philip allegedly exacerbated, or even subtly orchestrated, creating unrest. This deprivation led the exasperated soldiers to complain bitterly about young Gordian's leadership, seeing him as incompetent and disconnected. Philip skillfully used this growing discontent to present himself subtly at first as the only viable alternative, claiming Gordian was simply too weak, too inexperienced, or too utterly incompetent to truly lead Rome's legions in the harsh realities of war. He actively fostered resentment, poisoning the minds of the weary troops, painting the young emperor as unprepared for the brutal realities of war and imperial leadership. The tragic result in February 244 CE, likely near the modern-day city of Fallujah, Gordian III was either killed by his own mutinous troops, a swift, brutal, unceremonious end, or died under suspicious, carefully orchestrated circumstances masterminded by Philip. The official account immediately issued by Philip was that Gordian died from an unexpected illness, a convenient natural death. But ancient Roman historians like Eutropius and Zosimus strongly vehemently suggest it was a carefully planned assassination, one more murder in a long, bloody line. Philip the Arab swiftly, decisively proclaimed himself emperor, seizing the moment. Just 20 years old, Gordian III's short reign after an unexpected ascent ended as abruptly, as tragically as it had begun. He became yet another young emperor to be cut down before his prime, a symbol of Rome's continued profound instability, even with a seemingly beloved child on the throne, and a competent regent for a time pulling the intricate strings behind the scenes. It brutally illustrates the raw, undeniable power of the military during this era, and how quickly alliances and loyalties could shift, dooming even a popular, well-intentioned young emperor to a swift, bloody end. Allow the story of this young life to quietly recede, making space for gentle calm. We've journeyed through child emperors and warring senatorial partners, always, it seems, orbiting the relentless opportunistic Praetorian Guard, who truly seem to have a standing appointment, a perpetual calendar entry with imperial succession. Our previous young hopeful Gordian III lasted a remarkable 6 years, an anomaly for this period thanks primarily to his astute Praetorian prefect and father-in-law Timesitheus. But then, as all good or perhaps more often bad things do, Timesitheus's reign ended with his suspicious convenient death, opening the door for Philip the Arab to become Gordian III's new, far less benevolent and deeply ambitious prefect. And then, well, our beloved young Gordian III quietly and suddenly disappeared, most likely under Philip's manipulative, murderous hands. So Philip the Arab, having climbed the ranks of power with remarkable ambition, unwavering efficiency, and ruthless determination, quickly decisively installed himself as the new emperor of Rome. His story, his reign, is notable, not particularly for its brevity, but for the profound, overwhelming challenges he immediately faced upon taking the imperial reins. Let this next chapter gently begin as you breathe. Philip was quickly, almost instantaneously, proclaimed emperor by the troops in the distant east, far from the capital. He was above all pragmatic and realistic. His immediate priority, paramount above all else, was to end the costly, protracted war with Persia that Gordian III, or rather his capable regent Timesitheus, had been fighting so successfully at great expense to the empire. He struck a quick, surprisingly humiliating peace deal with the powerful Sassanid emperor Shapur I. The terms of this peace were largely and widely seen as incredibly humiliating for Rome. The Romans agreed to pay a substantial public indemnity, a large sum of money. They relinquished some hard-won territorial gains, and implicitly critically recognized the immense growing Persian threat to their eastern provinces. While Rome generally won more wars than it lost over its long imperial history, that's our mainstream historical fact, the overall trend of Roman military success against barbarian forces, this particular peace treaty with Persia, under Philip, was considered by many in Rome a profound, shameful retreat, an act of un-Roman cowardice. He paid the Persians, the mighty Romans, the conquerors of the world paid tribute. You can almost hear the widespread murmurs of disdain, the bitter complaints in the Senate among the common people, and certainly among the military leadership, perhaps quietly thinking, "Where's a Pertinax when you truly need one? A principled leader to fix the imperial treasury after that disastrous expensive deal." It was a pragmatic, immediate move to secure his shaky position as a newly proclaimed emperor, to free up precious legions to deal with more pressing threats elsewhere. But it certainly wasn't a glorious one. It was rather a concession born of desperate necessity. Allow the murmuring echoes of disapproval to gently dissipate as your thoughts settle. Philip the Arab, having temporarily stabilized the eastern frontier with that infamous controversial treaty, almost immediately turned his attention to Rome itself and to the urgent need to shore up his legitimacy. His reign is particularly famous for a monumental, unparalleled celebration, the secular games in 248 CE. These were immense, once-in-a-century festivals, commemorating Rome's supposed 1,000-year anniversary from its traditional mythical founding date in 753 BCE. This was a propaganda masterclass, a spectacle of imperial power, designed to astound and unify. Think of it gently in your mind. Massive games, grand processions of magnificent scale, lavish, dizzying displays of wealth and power, and all sorts of public entertainment designed to evoke Rome's glorious, storied past and distract from its precarious present. The entire city of Rome, and really the whole vast empire, was absolutely buzzing with the energy and excitement of this millennium celebration, a beacon of enduring Roman greatness. For this specific moment of spectacular Roman excess, there's a truly quirky tidbit. The secular games featured an unparalleled, almost unimaginable number of wild beasts. Scores of roaring lions, sleek leopards, enormous bears, rare hippos, even rhinos, some of the most exotic creatures known, brought to the colossal Colosseum for mass hunts, a spectacle of violent beauty. It was probably quite smelly, overwhelmingly so, with the scents of sweat, dust, blood, and animals, but absolutely thrilling beyond compare for the ancient Roman spectators. This incredible spectacle was a powerful statement of Roman endurance and vitality, brilliantly designed to distract from the empire's internal strife and the recent humbling peace with the Sassanid Persians. Allow the sounds and smells of this grand, distracting spectacle to slowly fade from your awareness. But beneath the glorious pomp and ceremony, beneath the dazzling displays of power and stability, serious chronic problems were quietly, relentlessly brewing. Philip had multiple sons, including Marcus Julius Severus Philippus, known as Philip II, whom he swiftly appointed as co-emperor, effectively trying to establish his own family dynasty, a hereditary line, something often fraught with peril. This immediately deeply rubbed many influential Romans the wrong way, reminding them uncomfortably of the previous troubles of hereditary succession, like the erratic, violent reign of Commodus, and how easily absolute power could become consolidated into the hands of an uncontrolled, untested family. However, Philip the Arab, despite his pragmatic diplomacy and his lavish celebrations, faced increasingly serious external and internal pressures that threatened to shatter his hold on power. While he was celebrating a millennium of Rome's past glories, the far-flung frontiers of the empire were in reality falling apart. Barbarian incursions were rampant across the Rhine and Danube frontiers, relentless waves of new enemies demanding constant military attention and rapidly draining Rome's dwindling resources. Economically, inflation was soaring out of control, as previous emperors had desperately debased the currency, shrunk the precious silver content of coins, leaving them almost worthless. You effectively needed a truck full of coins just to buy a few groceries. This led to widespread discontent among soldiers whose diminished pay lost its real value, and among civilians who struggled mightily to afford basic necessities. This growing unrest, combined with the ruinously expensive millennium celebrations and ongoing frontier wars, put enormous, unbearable strain on the imperial treasury and the public's already threadbare patience. The grand spectacle of the games couldn't last forever. The biggest, most direct challenge to Philip's rule came predictably from within the military itself. There were multiple significant rebellions throughout his reign, uprisings from frustrated, ambitious generals trying to usurp power, a deeply common defining theme in this turbulent crisis of the 3rd century. His policies, especially the perceived humiliation of the Persian peace treaty, and his continued desperate need to tax the struggling provinces heavily to fund his constant military expenditures, did not win him lasting popularity with the powerful legions who felt they deserved better treatment and a more glorious victory. When he ordered his new prefect Decius, a competent and disciplined military leader, to suppress an uprising in Moesia, a vital Roman province on the lower Danube frontier, Decius, having dealt with the threat, was surprisingly proclaimed emperor by his own victorious troops. It seems the Praetorian Guard weren't the only ones doing the emperor picking anymore. Powerful legions on the distant frontier had become kingmakers too, seizing their own autonomy. Decius, initially unwilling, likely overwhelmed by the soldiers' fierce enthusiasm and their sheer numbers, found himself simply unable to refuse his soldiers' insistent demands, and driven by his loyal troops, he started marching decisively on Rome. The familiar dance of rebellion had begun anew. In 249 CE, just 5 years after his accession, Philip the Arab and Decius met in a final climactic battle near Verona in northern Italy. Philip's reign ended in a brutal, decisive defeat. Philip himself was killed in the battle, possibly by his own disgruntled troops, who were already inclined towards Decius, a more popular, successful general. His young son Philip II, whom he had left in Rome as co-emperor in a desperate bid to establish a dynasty, was swiftly killed by the Praetorian Guard, who finally reliably reappear for their routine job of imperial cleanup once the grim news of Philip's defeat reached the capital. So much for trying to start a powerful dynasty. Another seemingly important reign ended in chaos and murder. Let the echoes of distant battle fade from your mind as you relax. Historians still quietly argue whether Philip's willingness to make an expedient, humiliating peace with Persia was a sign of pragmatic, far-sighted leadership, a necessary attempt to preserve the fragile empire in the face of overwhelming odds, or a catastrophic strategic miscalculation that foolishly emboldened Rome's powerful enemies and signaled weakness. What's undeniable, regardless of interpretation, is that his short, tumultuous reign sandwiched between two quick imperial successions truly set the stage for one of Rome's most turbulent, dangerous, and destabilizing periods in the centuries that followed. He successfully celebrated 1,000 years of Rome's glorious history, a testament to enduring power. Yet his own tenure ended just like so many others before and after him, violently, ignominiously, a victim of the very forces he sought to control. His struggle with both fierce Goths and the devastating widespread plague challenges that began after his accession would define the next emperors in our forgotten list, sadly emphasizing how fragile Rome's dominance had become, how delicate its very survival. Let this image of imperial fragility guide you to deeper rest. So Philip the Arab, despite his epic millennium celebrations, that grand, dazzling display of Roman endurance, met his inevitable fate at the Battle of Verona, tragically defeated by the very general he had dispatched to quell a rebellion. The legions, being fickle, opportunistic legions, simply declared Decius their victor and new champion, the new emperor. Philip's valiant, if ultimately failed, attempt to establish a new dynasty with his young son Philip II was predictably cut brutally short as the Praetorian Guard, once again demonstrating their reliability for timely, brutal assassination, quickly dispatched the boy in Rome, ending that imperial family's hopes. Now with Decius the Conqueror on the throne, the stage was ominously set for a whole new level of Roman calamity, one where not just barbarian incursions, but widespread plague and humiliating tribute-based peace would truly dominate the imperial agenda, bringing us to another tragically short-lived, deeply unlucky imperial pair. Gently breathe, allowing these details to become faint whispers. Decius's reign, which immediately begins our discussion of this particularly grim, relentlessly challenging period for Rome, was intense, fiercely religious, but alas, very short. He immediately instituted what is arguably one of the most controversial and historically impactful policies of the Roman Empire. The radical requirement that all Roman citizens across the vast empire actively prove their loyalty to the state by publicly offering sacrifices to the traditional Roman gods and to the sacred genius of the emperor. This, as a crucial mainstream historical fact, unequivocally sparked the first systematic empire-wide persecution of Christians, who, as you can easily imagine, absolutely steadfastly refused to participate, seeing it as an act of apostasy. Thousands were imprisoned, brutally tortured, or executed, including famously Pope Fabian, highlighting the fundamental, irreconcilable clash between deeply entrenched Roman state religion and the burgeoning, unwavering Christian faith. Decius, with sincere but misguided conviction, saw this policy as a necessary, urgent step to restore traditional Roman piety, restore faith, and ensure stability, genuinely believing Rome's increasing problems, its widespread calamities, stemmed from impious neglect of the ancient gods. But it backfired spectacularly. Achieving the very opposite of its aim, it created enduring martyrs, cemented a strong, defiant Christian identity against the state, and spread discord rather than unity. It was certainly an unforgettable, albeit painful, way to try and secure Rome's loyalty, allow the sound of religious conviction to fade into silence. But Decius didn't have much time to focus exclusively on religious purification and restoration. His true, far more immediate formidable nemesis arrived in the relentless form of barbarian incursions on an unprecedented, overwhelming scale. The Goths, a fierce, newly emergent Germanic tribe, were pressing hard on the Danube frontier, even launching significant naval raids into the vulnerable Roman provinces and cities along the Black Sea. This wasn't just small, irritating border skirmishes. These were large-scale coordinated invasions threatening the very heart of the empire. Decius, a military man first and foremost, a proven commander, took personal command of Rome's legions, valiantly attempting to repel them. His arduous efforts culminated in the decisive tragic Battle of Abritus in 251 CE, wherein an incredible and devastating blow to Roman morale and imperial pride, Decius himself, along with his beloved eldest son Herennius Etruscus, were killed in action, dying bravely on the battlefield. This marks another incredibly rare, almost unprecedented event in Roman history. Only the second and arguably the most significant emperor to fall in battle against a foreign foe. Truly the first emperor to ever be defeated and slain by barbarians. His younger son Hostilian, whom he had wisely perhaps left in Rome as co-emperor, was now left stranded utterly alone, hearing the news of his father's catastrophic death from afar. You can picture him. Wait, where's Dad? Oh, dead, in battle. Great! Who's in charge now? And what about the Goths? A chill wind of uncertainty sweeps over the land. And now on to Trebonianus Gallus. Gaius Vibius Trebonianus. Gallus, an aristocratic senator and a capable general, had been commanding part of the Roman army alongside Decius during this disastrous final Gothic campaign. When Decius and his son perished so brutally, the surviving legions, reeling from the profound defeat and in desperate need of immediate leadership, proclaimed Gallus as the new emperor on the battlefield. It was a chaotic battlefield acclamation, a snap decision under duress, and perhaps an unwilling one on Gallus's part, given the sheer magnitude and horror of the situation. He too, perhaps unwisely following a familiar but flawed pattern, appointed his young son Volusian as co-emperor, perhaps learning nothing from the long, often bloody history of imperial father-son duos, ending badly in this chaotic era. Another brief partnership for the throne. Gallus's immediate overwhelming priority, and arguably the most defining and by Roman standards, most shamefully indelible moment of his short reign, was the desperate peace treaty he signed with the Goths. This was an outright humiliation, a concession born of utter necessity, but deeply offensive to Roman pride. For a truly quirky tidbit about this treaty that reflects the utter desperation of the moment, Gallus agreed to let the Goths, those triumphant invaders, leave with all their captured Roman loot, vast quantities of wealth, slaves, and precious goods. And far worse, he explicitly promised them a staggering annual payment of gold, a form of direct, open tribute, in explicit exchange for them not attacking the Roman Empire again. Roman dignity hit an all-time soul-crushing low. Remember the subtle shame over Philip the Arab paying off the Persians with an indemnity. This was even worse. Rome, the mighty proud conqueror of the world, was literally paying its barbarian enemies not to invade. It probably made some of the tougher old-school Roman generals just groan in bitter disbelief, shaking their heads in utter disgust and despair, dreaming of glory past. Historians still quietly argue whether this humiliating tribute to the Goths was a truly necessary evil, a bitter pill to swallow to save what remained of Decius's battered army, and secure Rome's immediate precarious survival, or an utterly disgraceful, profoundly short-sighted act that set a very dangerous precedent for future barbarian demands, teaching them Rome's weakness. It was definitely not a shining moment in Roman military glory, but rather a somber, silent acceptance of declining power. Let the quiet murmurs of past humiliation fade from your consciousness. If paying off the Goths, bribing them to stay away wasn't bad enough, the empire was simultaneously being savagely ravaged by a devastating pandemic, probably a variant of the plague or smallpox, which swept like an invisible enemy across the entire Mediterranean world, killing vast, uncountable numbers of people. This terrifying plague lasted for years, relentlessly fundamentally weakening the already struggling empire, decimating legions, emptying cities, and devastating the civilian population. Gallus, despite his flawed political choices, dedicated himself to sincere public health measures, doing what he compassionately could, including overseeing the proper burial of countless plague victims, a genuinely humane, compassionate act for the time when many were simply left to rot. But it was an overwhelming, insurmountable crisis too vast for any emperor. Despite his very real efforts with the plague, Gallus's popularity plummeted even further. The disgraceful open peace treaty with the Goths, his decision to buy peace rather than fight for it, visibly rankled everyone, making him look weak, incompetent, and even un-Roman in the eyes of many. Compounding this, he utterly failed to follow through on initial promises to Roman soldiers to recover war booty lost to the Goths, which made him look even more untrustworthy and weak. His critics began to accuse him openly of being a mere servant to the Goths, having bought a false ephemeral peace instead of achieving a true lasting victory through Roman arms. He was further seen by the populace and by influential senators as arrogant and excessively luxury-loving, preferring banquets to the battlefield, and was specifically singled out for criticisms that he relied too heavily on incompetent cronies and blatantly neglected deserving, more capable military officers, leading to accusations of flagrant favoritism. The mainstream public probably sighed every time they heard another tax decree to pay for all these humiliating peacetime payments to those barbarian Goths. Their patience, already thin, began to unravel completely. Then came another challenge, the inevitable challenger Aemilian. You remember him. Well, no you don't, yet he's coming next after this brief pause for tranquility. Aemilian was the governor of Moesia, a vital Roman province on the Danube frontier, precisely where the Gothic problem was still relentlessly simmering, a constant threat. Tired of Gallus's humiliating, cowardly policies and sensing an immediate, crucial opportunity for glory and power, Aemilian boldly refused to pay the Goths their annual shameful tribute, then after careful preparation decisively defeated them in battle, restoring Roman honor. This was a glorious, undeniable victory, a breath of fresh air after years of humiliation and paying enemies. The victorious troops, seeing a strong, resolute leader who refused to pay tribute, who delivered victory, hailed Aemilian as emperor. You know what inevitably happens next, don't you? A fresh challenge. Allow the echoes of distant battles to softly fade into the silence. Gallus and his co-emperor's son Volusian, already struggling, panicked. They swiftly assembled an army, pulling troops from elsewhere, including Valerian, a respected future emperor, who was in command of the legions on the Rhine and marching to meet them. In August 253 CE, Gallus and Volusian marched to meet Aemilian. But the Praetorian Guard, that omnipresent, fickle force likely influenced by Valerian's impending arrival with his stronger, more veteran forces, or simply weary of another seemingly incompetent, widely unpopular emperor, once again seized swift, brutal control. They killed both Trebonianus Gallus and Volusian at an obscure place in Italy, an unknown grave for forgettable reigns. Their bodies were reportedly dumped into a ditch without proper burial, a stark, fittingly unceremonious end for two emperors who tried to salvage the empire through humiliation and found little favor from their own soldiers or, crucially, their Praetorian Guard. The brevity of their reign and its unceremonious, brutal conclusion underscore Rome's deepening, spiraling chaos, ushering in the shortest reign will cover almost a footnote to a footnote in history's long, intricate narrative. Rest now deeply and calmly. So Trebonianus Gallus and his son Volusian, the emperors who tried to buy peace from the menacing Goths with gold and humility, had met their untimely, brutal demise, summarily murdered by the ever-present, ever-reliable Praetorian Guard, who it seems had truly kept up a lucrative, bloody side hustle in imperial succession. This cleared the path decisively for Aemilian, the very general who had actually defeated the Goths, instead of paying them to become the new emperor. You'd think, wouldn't you, finally a triumphant military man, a man of action to restore true Roman dignity and power. But Roman imperial history, especially in this turbulent century, rarely adheres to simple, happy endings. Aemilian's ascent is one of the most meteoric, dazzling, and tragically brief in Roman history. An ultimate vivid demonstration of the barrack emperor phenomenon that relentlessly gripped the Roman world throughout the entire 3rd century. Emperors rising from the military camps and falling just as fast. Gaius Julius Aemilianus was from genuinely humble origins, reportedly African or Mauritanian. Like many ambitious, determined men of the period, he rose swiftly through the tough military ranks, eventually becoming the respected governor of Moesia Superior, a crucial frontier province on the dangerous Danube. He'd been quietly, bitterly chafing under Trebonianus Gallus's disgraceful, shameful peace treaty with the Goths, that shameful annual payment of gold you just heard about. So in 253 CE, after Rome, either intentionally or due to chronic treasury woes, missed one of its humiliating tribute payments, the Goths, emboldened, immediately resumed their destructive raids. This moment was Aemilian's crucial career-making moment. He boldly promised his battle-hardened soldiers the entire booty of war if they won, convinced them to abandon the humiliating treaty payments, and decisively defeated the Goths in a resounding, glorious victory that finally conclusively expelled them from Roman territory. Imagine the elation, the renewed sense of pride in his weary troops tired of Rome's incessant humiliations, finally celebrating a genuine triumph, a real Roman victory. Aemilian's decisive victory immediately made him a hero to his loyal legions. You know what inevitably happens when a reigning emperor is widely despised and a competent general wins a truly significant, liberating battle. The loyal legions hail their victorious general as emperor. It was the tried and true formula, the consistent pattern of the time, etched in blood and ambition. This mainstream historical fact is clear and undeniable. Aemilian was proclaimed emperor by his victorious troops right there on the battlefield, completely bypassing the long-established Roman Senate and the usual political niceties, illustrating the raw, untamed power of provincial armies in selecting new emperors during this increasingly turbulent, chaotic era. He immediately marched his triumphant army toward Rome, bypassing Gallus and Volusian, who were desperately in the process of raising scratch armies to try and challenge him. They met near the modern-day city of Interamna Nahars, when Gallus and Volusian's dispirited troops found themselves facing Aemilian's disciplined and highly motivated veterans, and also learned the unsettling news that the respected General Valerian, whose large armies from the Rhine had been summoned by Gallus to help, but were still far away, was already publicly supporting Aemilian's claims they mutinied swiftly and brutally against their current unpopular emperors. Aemilian's forces didn't even need to engage in direct combat. The Praetorian Guard, ever eager for a change of leadership, if it meant their survival or a bigger payday, promptly dispatched Gallus and Volusian, saving Aemilian the effort. Just like that, Aemilian had eliminated his two rivals without even needing to dirty his own sword. The stage was set once again for a powerful new and, one would hope, enduring ruler. Aemilian then swiftly advanced on Rome itself, where the ever-pragmatic Senate, always ready to acknowledge the de facto power, quickly confirmed him as emperor. Imagine Aemilian was hailed as the great savior, the heroic general who finally restored Roman martial pride and ended years of disgrace. It seemed like his meteoric, incredibly rapid rise from obscure provincial general to conquering hero, then to emperor, in a matter of mere months, might genuinely signify a turning point in Rome's long, turbulent fortunes. His reign began with enormous public goodwill even in Rome, largely because he'd finally kicked the Goths where it hurt and ended the humiliating tribute payments. He probably stood before the Roman Senate, perhaps wearing his freshly polished armor, looking every bit the conquering hero, whilst subtly wondering why all these well-dressed, dignified old men look so surprised by his mere presence. Here's a quirky little tidbit about Aemilian. He reportedly marched so swiftly, so relentlessly towards Rome with his victorious troops, that he wore his men out, setting an almost impossible pace, pushing them beyond their limits. He was intensely eager to press his advantage, to consolidate his gains, and to secure his precarious claim to the imperial throne before any other ambitious general could gather forces and challenge him. It speaks to his almost obsessive drive, his burning ambition to seize the fleeting moment, perhaps sensing correctly that his window of opportunity was exceedingly narrow. He certainly didn't dither. However, this relentless haste, this rapid advance might have ultimately backfired in a fatal way. But what Aemilian ultimately lacked, crucially, was an established network of political allies and deep support systems within the Byzantine political jungle that was Rome itself, that web of patronage and family ties. His popularity was purely military, founded on one battle, and in the complex cutthroat chessboard of Roman power politics, an ambitious general could rise spectacularly fast like a comet, but fall even faster if he didn't secure broader, deeper alliances to sustain his rule. And he soon faced a critical, fatal problem: Valerian. Valerian was a highly respected senator, a man of ancient noble birth, steeped in tradition, who had been commanding the powerful legions on the Rhine frontier, Rome's main force in the west. He was already a formidable rival, a powerful figure even before Aemilian was hastily hailed as emperor. Valerian had been honorably summoned by Gallus and Volusian before their deaths, and his forces were already inexorably marching towards Rome to support the previous, now defunct regime, essentially becoming the final unforeseen wave of overwhelming military power. Upon hearing of Gallus's and Volusian's demise and Aemilian's rapid illegitimate takeover, Valerian simply calmly continued his march on Rome now, with the clear, unyielding intention of challenging Aemilian directly for the ultimate prize. The looming, undeniable threat of Valerian, a seasoned, highly capable general with large, well-equipped legions, immediately destabilized Aemilian's precarious position. The very soldiers who had hailed him emperor, his adoring legions, now began visibly to question their quick choice, their recent allegiance. Why follow this quickly risen African general who didn't even have deep family connections, no aristocratic roots, or the Senate's consistent long-term backing, when a more traditional noble general with a stronger, impeccable military reputation and a more legitimate claim was marching slowly but surely towards them? Their fickle, easily swayed loyalty quickly shifted, melting like Roman wax in the summer sun. Aemilian was literally caught between a rock and an armored, inexorable place. His brief time on the throne, a mere 88 days, demonstrates starkly and painfully how raw military power, even fresh from a victory, was often not nearly enough to maintain control, especially if an even stronger or better connected rival backed by ancient lineage quickly emerged. Let that difficult truth softly descend into your consciousness. In a dramatic yet rather anticlimactic fashion, before Aemilian and Valerian could even engage in a decisive head-to-head battle that would have shaped Rome's fate, Aemilian's own weary, disheartened troops decided his short imperial tenure was over, effectively terminating his contract. At Spoleto in Italy, just as they prepared to face Valerian's formidable approaching forces, his own soldiers murdered him, an unexpected coup from within. His reign lasted only about 88 days, some ancient sources say even fewer, making him one of the absolute shortest-lived Roman emperors in the empire's long history. His dramatic ascent from obscure provincial governor to conquering hero, then to short-lived emperor, only to be murdered by his own troops before he could even properly settle on the throne, profoundly underscores the treacherous, chilling volatility of the 3rd century imperial throne, a seat often decided by the blade, not the ballot. Historians still quietly argue whether Aemilian's extremely short reign was a direct result of Valerian's superior military threat and the traditional power of senatorial influence, or simply the unfortunate timing of his rise amidst an even more powerful, more legitimate, and more popular challenger appearing right behind him. Whichever it was, Aemilian's swift, ignominious demise illustrates perfectly the inherent perils of trying to lead the vast troubled empire when powerful rivals, or indeed even more powerful plagues, lurked just around every corner, poised to strike as Valerian, his ultimate successor, would soon discover himself in the most painful, humiliating way imaginable. Let this final thought gently carry you to profound rest. So, Aemilian, the victorious general who bravely ended those humiliating payments to the threatening Goths, had, despite his initial triumph, one of the shortest reigns in all of Roman history, swiftly done in by his own disgruntled troops, before he could even properly meet his main rival, the formidable Valerian. With Aemilian so quickly gone, the imperial mantle officially passed to Valerian. You'll remember him as that senior senator, the man of noble birth and respected general whose legions on the Rhine were summoned by the ill-fated Gallus, and who ultimately overshadowed Aemilian by simply existing. Valerian's accession marks another chapter, a significant one, in Rome's accelerating brutal decline, characterized by not just relentless external enemies attacking from every frontier, but also by internal political strife and the terrifying, decimating reality of widespread, incurable plagues sweeping through the population, leaving ruin in their wake. Allow this somber realization to deepen your calm. Publius Licinius Valerianus, already an elderly man, probably around 60 years old when he finally became emperor in 253 CE, recognized the daunting, seemingly impossible task before him. He tried earnestly to bring order, some semblance of control, to a chaotic, disintegrating empire, establishing himself as a traditional, stern Roman figure dedicated to duty. The empire, by his accession, was under relentless attack on multiple disparate fronts, from the fierce Goths and Franks in the east, to the relentless Germanic tribes in the west, and the aggressive Sassanid Persians threatening from the far east. His immediate and very pragmatic strategic move was to elevate his beloved son, Publius Licinius Egnatius Gallienus, to co-emperor, hoping to ensure continuity and theoretically allowing them to divide the enormous, overwhelming task of defending the vast, sprawling empire. Valerian himself courageously chose to go east to face the formidable, newly ascendant Sassanid Persian Empire, led by the incredibly powerful, cunning, and aggressive Shapur-Burs, while Gallienus remained in the west, defending tirelessly against the incessant Germanic invasions. This mainstream historical fact, the appointment of two co-emperors, a father and son team yet again, was a practical, grim recognition of the empire's fractured, beleaguered state, effectively dividing its military and administrative responsibilities in the face of overwhelming, unmanageable external threats. They literally had to cut the empire in half, not by choice, not for administrative ease, but by dire, desperate necessity, by the brutal realities of the battlefield. The weight of that decision presses down on history. Valerian's campaign in the east initially showed a fragile promise, securing some minor victories against the Persians. But then disaster struck, a profound, unimaginable calamity for Rome, an event utterly unique in its long history. In 260 CE, during or shortly after the brutal Battle of Edessa, the exact details are debated as usual, shrouded in the mists of ancient memory, Valerian became the first and only Roman emperor in Rome's nearly 1,000-year history to be captured alive by a foreign enemy. Not killed in battle, which was a grim but honorable end, but captured. Think about that, dear listener, the supreme living ruler of the most powerful empire in the known world, the mighty Roman emperor actually taken prisoner, marched off in chains by the Sassanid Persians. It was an unimaginable humiliation for proud Rome, a searing, indelible stain on its imperial pride, a stark, painful testament to the empire's profoundly faltering power and the Sassanids' growing undeniable might. Shapur I, the triumphant Persian king, reportedly kept Valerian in humiliating servitude for the rest of his wretched life, parading him around like a personal trophy in grand ceremonies, and perhaps most painfully even using him as a personal footstool when mounting his majestic horse, forcing the great Roman emperor to bend beneath his master. There's a truly grotesque, quirky tidbit here. A whisper of historical horror. Some ancient accounts, particularly Persian ones, chillingly claim that after Valerian's death, Shapur, in a final act of ultimate contempt, had his skin flayed from his body and then grotesquely stuffed with straw, preserving him as a gruesome permanent monument to Persian triumph in a revered temple. Even if the straw-stuffed part isn't strictly literally true, though the fact it was reported highlights its lasting horror, the very existence of such a story highlights the depths of Rome's perceived shame and the utterly horrifying severity of Valerian's ultimate unredeemed fate. Historians still quietly argue about the precise circumstances of his capture, debating whether it was a deliberate betrayal by his own panicked troops, a tactical blundering, or a genuine unavoidable military disaster combined with Shapur's cunning military genius. But whatever the reason, it was a profound, soul-crushing blow to Roman morale and global prestige, marking an unprecedented nadir. Allow this profound, somber image to gently deepen your peace. Valerian's humiliating, unimaginable capture was immediately followed by a new, intensified phase of profound chaos, fragmentation, and instability. While his son Gallienus was recognized as sole emperor in Rome, holding the nominal reins of power, other powerful generals and wealthy provinces rebelled, forming audacious breakaway splinter empires, essentially declaring their own regional independence, rather than trying to become the main legitimate emperor. Two main breakaway states dramatically emerged from Rome's fracturing grasp: the independent Gallic Empire in the west, comprising Gaul, Britain, and Spain, and the powerful Palmyrene Empire in the east, led by Queen Zenobia. Imagine Rome, the once unbreakable monolith, suddenly being the only major piece left on the geopolitical chessboard, surrounded by several smaller but increasingly powerful pieces that had declared themselves separate games, entirely autonomous and defiant. Gallienus, though energetic and militarily capable, a good general himself, was constantly fighting relentless internal revolts one after another, and simultaneously defending against external invasions on all fronts. He never notably attempted to free his father. Even contemplating such a daring rescue was impossible, trapped as Valerian was deep in Persia. And for many proud Romans, this apparent indifference to his beloved father's gruesome, publicly known fate, his ongoing public humiliation, became a lasting damning mark against his rule, regardless of the utter impossibility of rescuing him from Persia's iron grasp. The subtle tension of this historical tragedy dissolves into your relaxation. We're drawing closer to closing our long, often somber list of fleeting emperors now. Remember our last two, who we have yet to formally encounter, figures barely a whisper in the winds of time. One of the very last obscure emperors we need to meet is Hostilian. C. Valerius Hostilianus was Decius's younger son, the innocent brother of Herennius Etruscus, who was tragically killed alongside his valiant father in that disastrous cataclysmic battle against the Goths. When Trebonianus Gallus assumed the imperial purple on the chaotic battlefield after Decius's death, Hostilian was quietly left behind in Rome, a mere child, a symbolic co-emperor. Gallus attempting to shore up his very shaky legitimacy, and possibly trying to calm a Roman populace that still widely loved the deceased Decius, strategically declared Hostilian his dead predecessor's son, his co-emperor. It was an act of cold political expediency, an attempt to attach himself, however tenuous, to the popular tragic legacy of the deceased emperor, but also probably just an agreement with Valerian for a seamless accepted power transfer in hopes of unity. So for a very short while, for a mere flickering moment, Rome truly had three co-emperors, Trebonianus Gallus, his son Volusian, and Decius's innocent son Hostilian. Three emperors jostling for power, at least symbolically. It must have been a very busy, very tense, very confusing palace indeed. However, Hostilian's brief reign, if you can even dignify it with such a grand title, was incredibly tragically short, and frankly utterly sad. Before Gallus and Volusian even had a chance to march north to face Aemilian, their impending rival, the great devastating plague, you remember it, the one savagely ravaging the entire empire, an invisible enemy striking everywhere, swept remorselessly through Rome itself. And tragically, unexpectedly, young Hostilian, having barely been emperor for a few fleeting months, a political pawn, succumbed to the pestilence in 251 CE. Historians still quietly debate the exact circumstances of his rapid death. Was it indeed the plague, as conveniently reported, a natural and unavoidable demise? Or was he perhaps more sinisterly, conveniently poisoned by Trebonianus Gallus and Volusian, eager to remove a potential rival who represented the legitimacy of Decius, or even just lighten the triple emperor load, streamlining the troubled administration? His quick and unremarkable passing is yet another somber example of the extreme fragility of life and the inherent impermanence of power in the bewildering chaos of the mid-3rd century. Hostilian truly was a forgotten victim, barely more than a brief footnote, even in his own turbulent time, swallowed silently by pestilence and cold, calculated political machinations, before he could even properly assert himself or be seen as a true force. Allow the quiet passing of this forgotten figure to guide you into deeper stillness. Finally, we meet the very last pair, the very final strange characters for our Roman bedtime stories. Remember how Gallienus Valerian's son had that massive, overwhelming problem with breakaway empires fracturing Rome, with the Praetorians still being utterly volatile and unpredictable, and the legions themselves constantly seeking new, more effective leaders amidst the turmoil? His own general Aureolus revolted and audaciously declared himself emperor, adding another layer to Rome's complex internal conflicts. Gallienus rushed to meet him, eventually besieging him in Milan. But while fighting this exhausting internal war, Gallienus himself, like so many before him, was tragically assassinated by his very own officers, tired of the endless struggle. He was yet another painful example of an emperor unable to truly unite the warring factions within his own fractured military. This final act of rebellion paved the way for Claudius Gothicus, a fierce, highly capable soldier, who swiftly, decisively restored some measure of imperial control and military glory to Rome. And this brings us at long last to a father-son duo whose remarkably strange, rather ignominious exit from history beautifully bookends our list of emperors who didn't quite make it, who simply weren't meant for the long haul. We've reached the final, somewhat scandalous, perhaps even smelly, ignominious tales of imperial endings. Our second to last obscure emperor for tonight, just before we drift completely into dreams, is Numerian, formerly Marcus Aurelius. Numerius Numerianus, the younger son of Emperor Carus. In 282 CE, Emperor Carus became ruler, immediately appointing his two sons Carinus and Numerian as Caesars, and then quickly pragmatically elevating both to co-emperors. Again, the familiar old father-son team approach to Roman leadership, trying to ensure continuity. Carus, a military strongman through and through, a fierce general, immediately marched east to launch an ambitious campaign against the mighty Persians, leaving his older son Carinus in charge of the vast Western Empire from distant Rome. Numerian, his younger, somewhat more academic son, reluctantly joined him on the grueling Eastern campaign. The campaign was wildly surprisingly successful. The Romans invaded Mesopotamia, took the Persian capital of Ctesiphon, and truly inflicted heavy, humiliating losses on their Persian foes. A triumphant moment for Rome. However, after these glorious, hard-won victories, Emperor Carus died very suddenly and mysteriously in 283 CE, far from Rome in Mesopotamia. He was reportedly struck down by a miraculous bolt of lightning, or perhaps by a lingering illness, exacerbated by a campaign, or, far more likely, secretly brutally assassinated by an ambitious rival. Given how convenient this sudden bolt of lightning was illuminating an otherwise dark political landscape, historians have openly speculated and argued whether his cunning Praetorian prefect Aper had a very direct, murderous hand in it, removing the powerful emperor to advance his own agenda. So now suddenly, young Numerian found himself a solitary co-emperor, nominally ruling alongside his flamboyant, less responsible and far-off brother Carinus. But crucially, he was now without his powerful guiding father, and stuck deep in Persian territory, surrounded by exhausted war-weary legions. The true peril was just beginning. Numerian, now effectively the sole leader of the army despite his youth, decided the best, most pragmatic course of action was to immediately abandon the deep Persian campaign and begin the long, arduous return journey to Rome. The army, eager to return home, began its long march back through the desolate lands of Mesopotamia and the winding paths of Anatolia. But it soon became disturbingly evident that Numerian himself was severely ill, and his eyes were particularly sensitive to the bright, piercing light of the east, possibly an infection making it painfully difficult for him to ride openly on horseback or appear publicly to his troops. So a clever, if isolating, solution was devised. He began traveling exclusively inside a tightly closed, heavily guarded, elaborately curtained litter carried by his personal guards. This kept him entirely secluded from public view, and perhaps also kept him comfortably cool and secure during the long, arduous journey. This was quite the peculiar spectacle, a strange, silent procession, an emperor completely sealed away from his own army, a ghost ruler traveling in unseen luxury. Let the imagery of that closed litter gently soothe you to sleep. But, and here's a truly unforgettable, remarkably quirky tidbit that etched this emperor's brief tale into history. After several days of relentless travel of marching onwards with the closed litter, a distinctly unsettlingly unpleasant smell began to unmistakably emanate from it. Imagine, dear listener, marching in an ancient Roman army day after weary day, across endless dusty plains, and the emperor's personal carriage begins to smell suspiciously, undeniably foul. Not exactly the imperial incense one would expect his generals, and the powerful Praetorian Guard grew increasingly suspicious. Something was definitely horrifyingly amiss behind those tightly drawn curtains. Historians still quietly argue about Aper's true motives for keeping the emperor's apparent death secret for so long. Was it a cunning ploy to seize control for himself, to maintain discipline, and ensure a smoother, less chaotic retreat of the army? Or simply to ensure a more favorable, carefully controlled succession for himself? Whatever his hidden intent, it definitely disastrously did not go according to plan. They cut open the elaborate litter, forced it open, and to their horror they discovered that Numerian was undeniably, irrevocably dead, his young body already in a state of gruesome decomposition. He had likely died several days earlier, quietly perhaps in his sleep, while journeying in the sealed box, making his treacherous prefect Aper the very last man we'll speak about in connection with this strange imperial journey, a man whose brief taste of power was truly accompanied by a very distinct, very lingering and deeply unsettling odor, and whose fate was soon to be sealed. His ignominious passing marks the final gentle cadence of this strange imperial lullaby. You remember Carus, that fierce soldier emperor whose glorious Persian campaign abruptly ended with his sudden, incredibly convenient death by lightning. And then his younger son Numerian reluctantly leading the vast army back only for his sealed imperial litter to develop a rather noticeable, extremely unpleasant odor, chillingly revealing he too had silently expired within it, almost certainly by the ruthless machinations of his ambitious, murderous Praetorian prefect Aper. The entire, vast Roman army learned of their emperor's demise through their very noses. It truly doesn't get more obscure or more unexpectedly wonderfully smelly than that, does it? This dramatic, disgusting discovery occurring far, far from Rome in the distant east meant the actual center of the empire and the true succession to Rome's powerful throne was still in play, utterly unresolved. Aper quickly made himself very unpopular, very despised with the legions trying to brazenly usurp control after Carus's mysterious death and Numerian's concealed one. But the Eastern army, in a rapid, decisive move, swiftly hailed a far more capable, more charismatic officer named Diocles, who would later become the legendary Diocletian, one of Rome's most transformative figures as emperor, who promptly had Aper executed, cutting short his ambition and removing that particular foul smell. You see a clear, unchanging pattern emerging with those ruthless Praetorian prefects, don't you? Their ambitions rarely end well for them. Let that smell and those swift Roman events softly drift away into the stillness. So as we move into the final decadent chapter of our parade of short-lived, largely forgotten emperors, one burning question quietly looms. Who was the other son of Carus, the flamboyant, estranged brother to the literally decomposing Numerian, whose fate was tied to the smelly litter? That, dear listener, would be Marcus Aurelius Carinus, our final, rather notorious, incredibly colorful emperor. He was Carus's older son, whom Carus had perhaps unwisely left in charge of the entire western part of the vast Roman Empire when he went off to conquer distant Persia. And by in charge, we mean Carinus embarked on a joyous spree of epic indulgence, mind-boggling public spectacle, and truly flamboyant, almost defiant decadence. He seemed utterly convinced that if the empire itself wasn't exactly in good shape, wasn't perfectly stable, at least its emperor was enjoying himself and was spending money with glorious abandon. This sets the stage for one of the last colorful flashes of a genuinely self-indulgent, self-serving ruler before the empire would soon after undergo a truly significant, stern, almost puritanical restructuring under the powerful, uncompromising Diocletian. Let the colors of his excess soften in your mind. The mainstream historical fact about Carinus's reign, which was short-lived as sole emperor but lasted about 2 extravagant years as co-emperor with his stern father, is that he presided over Rome's last truly lavish, unapologetically indulgent era before the grim austerity and military focus of the Tetrarchy, the rigid reforms of Diocletian. He threw colossal public games and spectacles in Rome, truly astonishing displays meant to dazzle and impress. He famously ordered a spectacle that involved parading an incredible quantity of various types of exotic wild beasts, including roaring lions, formidable bears, and fearsome tigers into the arena, hundreds upon hundreds of them, before they were regrettably put to death for entertainment, all as a glorious display of Roman might, its enduring power, and his own unbounded wealth and lack of taste. These weren't just big. They were ridiculously, absurdly over the top, even by Rome's famously high standards of extravagance, solely meant to entertain, to distract, and to dazzle a populace increasingly accustomed to less glamorous, often battle-worn soldier emperors like those we've encountered. His personal entourage was said to be ridiculously, hilariously extravagant, filled to the brim with mimes, acrobats, famous charioteers actors, and other numerous purveyors of sensual pleasure and diversion. He even ostentatiously had his sandals embroidered with precious jewels gleaming with gold and gems. He definitely utterly understood how to enjoy the opulent trappings of power, if not necessarily its immense burdensome responsibilities. But beneath the glittering surface of spectacle and self-indulgence, Quirinus was deeply unpopular, especially among the proud Roman senatorial elite. He had a widespread, unsavory reputation for debauchery, for taking and discarding scandalous multiple marriages, and for openly despising and humiliating many prominent, respectable senators. His court was a mess of unscrupulous cronies and low-born favorites who shamelessly indulged his excesses and enriched themselves at the state's precious expense. The quirky tidbit here is that he reportedly had a very specific, elaborate imperial bath routine, where he would start in incredibly cold water, then gradually move to tepid, then increasingly hot to prove his physical constitution, his strength. And then he would apparently host unimaginably extravagant banquets that involved golden furniture lavishly prepared, and exotic dishes, and a never-ending, dizzying parade of delicacies flown in from all corners of the empire. Imagine, dear listener, a leader so utterly obsessed with showing off that even his personal bath times were legendary, not his battlefield victories or administrative achievements. He definitely wasn't looking to get bogged down in bureaucratic details, when there were so many delightful, sensuous ways to spend imperial money and demonstrate his frivolous power. Allow these lavish images to softly drift into your consciousness. When news finally belatedly reached him in Rome that his stern father Carus and his sensitive brother Numerian were both tragically, mysteriously dead in the distant east, it momentarily solidified Quirinus's precarious position as sole emperor of the vast fractured Roman Empire. However, by this point, the loyal Eastern armies, after discovering Numerian's unpleasant end and having decisively dealt with the treacherous Aper, had already proclaimed their own new emperor, the efficient, highly disciplined, and utterly formidable General Diocles, who would later become the legendary Diocletian, one of Rome's most transformative, iron-willed rulers. The eastern and western halves of the empire were now clearly led by two wildly different men figures, embodying starkly different approaches to rule. It inevitably set the stage for a climatic, unavoidable showdown that epitomizes the barrack emperor problem of the 3rd century, where ultimate power was ultimately decided by sheer military force and brute strength, not by inheritance or the hollow decree of a desperate senate. Historians still quietly argue whether Quirinus's legendary, almost mythical decadence was the result of a deliberate, calculated policy to win over the Roman masses through bread and circuses, a profound lack of seriousness towards the demanding imperial office, or simply a convenient excuse to portray him as a weak and unworthy opponent by the new puritanical, utterly moralizing Diocletian. Quirinus, gathering his western armies, the remnants of Rome's power, bravely, somewhat reluctantly marched east to meet Diocletian and his forces. The final showdown took place at the brutal Battle of the Margus in Moesia in 285 CE. Quirinus actually possessed the larger and, on paper, arguably stronger army, consisting of hardened veterans who had served under his formidable father Carus. The battle was fiercely contested, a chaotic maelstrom of clashing steel and desperate cries. Initially, Quirinus's forces, superior in number and experience, seemed to be winning, pushing back Diocletian's smaller army. The very future of the Roman Empire literally hung in the precarious balance, a chaotic swirl of banners, javelins, shouted commands, and the clash of thousands of lives. But in a swift and shocking twist, just as Quirinus's forces gained the crucial upper hand, he was abruptly, lethally assassinated by one of his own tribunes. The precise motives remain unclear, perhaps a personal grievance, a private hatred finally unleashed. Perhaps it was covertly instigated by Diocletian, a cunning preemptive strike. Or perhaps his general unpopularity and tyrannical nature among the military had simply bubbled over at the absolute critical moment of battle. Whatever the reason, with their emperor suddenly decisively dead, Carinus's leaderless army promptly logically switched allegiance and swore loyalty to the triumphant Diocletian, abandoning the body of their former emperor. And just like that, Carinus, the emperor of gold-embroidered shoes, elaborate bath routines and over-the-top parties, vanished from the imperial stage, a mere flicker in the vastness of time. His colorful yet largely ineffective reign marks the unceremonious end of a brief, unusual imperial family, and in many significant ways, the final conclusion of the most chaotic, destabilizing period of the crisis of the 3rd century. With Diocletian firmly on the throne, Rome would at last see the beginning of fundamental sweeping reforms, the introduction of the powerful tetrarchy, and a stern, determined attempt to restore order after decades, brutal decades of constant turmoil, civil wars, and quick, often absurd imperial successions, a period where power was almost exclusively decided by the nearest, strongest army. Carinus's fall, his final sudden disappearance, ushered in a new dawn for Rome, though one marked by iron will and rigid structure, rather than by golden luxury and endless spectacle. His life and the often ignominious swift end of many others we've journeyed through tonight truly underscores how fleeting, how ephemeral, and how brutally dangerous imperial power could be in a collapsing, changing world. Allow the grand history of Rome to gently lull you to the very brink of sleep. The Roman world, we gently leave it tonight, is gradually settling into a long period of more rigid organization, a period of rebuilding under strong centralized rule. But for these forgotten figures, these emperors who pass through the imperial stage like shadows, the brief, intense flicker of their time and power is a vivid, profound reminder of a desperate, bewildering age, a crucible of power and fate. They were brave generals and humble teachers, quiet scholars and flamboyant party animals, innocent children and wise old men, each unexpectedly, violently, sometimes unwillingly propelled to the absolute pinnacle of power, only to be swept away almost as quickly by the relentless tides of history, by ambitious generals, by plague, or by their own shortcomings. Their names, perhaps obscure, perhaps rarely remembered, paint a rich, complex, chaotic tapestry of a world in profound flux. 1,000 years of an empire's journey distilled into 66 days, or 8 months, or even just the incredibly short length of a single imperial litter journey through the dusty, echoing plains. As the stories of these emperors gently fade from your awareness, as the grand theater of ancient Rome begins to quiet down for the night, allow the vivid historical imagery of sun-baked roads, stern senators debating the clash of unseen armies, and golden-crusted imperial baths with their unseen smells, to gently recede from your mind, becoming mere whispers on the edge of your consciousness. Picture the slow, quiet, peaceful fall of twilight over the famous 7 hills of Rome, and the gentle, calming breeze whispering softly through ancient olive groves, rustling the leaves. The ambitious, shouting voices of emperors and generals have fallen silent. The distant clatter of marching legions has dimmed into silence, and even the pungent aroma from the hidden final litter has dissipated, leaving only the purity of the night. All that remains now is the hush of ancient history and the gentle comfort of the quiet night embracing you. Allow your breath to deepen, to become slow and rhythmic, and your thoughts to soften much, like the gentle fall of a Roman sunset painting the sky with colors of peace. The emperors have played their parts, their dramatic, brief roles now complete. And now, dear friend, it's time for quietude, for profound, restful sleep. You've journeyed far, so very far, through their brief and tumultuous reigns across centuries of history. And now, it's time to truly drift. Let the calmness wash over you, a gentle wave from the tips of your toes to the softest strands of your hair, from the furthest corners of your mind to the depths of your being. As the whispers of long-forgotten empires of ambition and fall finally fade entirely into the realm of dreams, rest peacefully deeply and find your own quietude, your perfect sleep. Good night.